Imagine a life defined by hardship, where every turn feels like a test of resilience. In today's story, we follow Sara, a young girl who's been through unimaginable struggles and betrayal. Just when things seem to be turning around, her past threatens to pull her back into a world she's desperate to leave behind. Can Sara finally find peace, justice, and a family who truly supports her? Or will she be trapped by her history forever? Watch to the end to see how her journey unfolds. And don't forget, if this story moves you, make sure to comment, like, and subscribe to stay connected with us for more powerful stories like this. Mark Delaney strode down the polished marble floors of his company's main lobby, his steps echoing against the high ceilings. He was a tall man in his early 40s, impeccably dressed in a custom-tailored suit that projected success. Mark's aura was intimidating, his gaze sharp and his movements precise. People around him either scurried out of his way or nodded respectfully, understanding that he was a man who expected nothing less than perfection. For Mark, life was a series of goals to be conquered. Wealth, status, and influence were markers of his success, and he wore them as proudly as his designer clothing. He prided himself on being a self-made man, someone who had built his empire from the ground up, and he had little patience for anyone he deemed lazy or unambitious. As he reached the glass doors of the building, his phone buzzed. "Paul," he muttered with a smile as he glanced at the screen. Paul Mitchell, his longtime friend, was someone Mark considered his only equal, a successful entrepreneur with a thriving business of his own. Their friendship was built on a mutual respect for ambition and achievement. He made a mental note to return Paul's call later in the day. Lost in thought, Mark stepped outside and was immediately engulfed by the bustling energy of the city. The street was filled with people hurrying to their destinations, a mixture of office workers, tourists, and the occasional street vendor. Mark loved this chaos. It was the pulse of his world, a constant reminder of the grind that had brought him to the top. As he walked towards his car, a faint voice interrupted his thoughts. "Excuse me, sir," came a quiet, hesitant voice. Mark turned, his eyes falling on a young girl standing on the edge of the sidewalk. She was thin, her clothes worn and faded, and she looked around 13 years old. Her dark eyes held a mix of defiance and vulnerability, a spark that seemed out of place amid her shabby appearance. "Yes," he responded curtly, already annoyed by the interruption. The girl hesitated, as if weighing the consequences of speaking up. I'm sorry to bother you, but I need some help. Just a few dollars, maybe, to get something to eat." Mark felt a flicker of irritation rise within him. His entire life philosophy revolved around hard work and self-reliance. To him, asking for money on the street was a sign of failure, of not trying hard enough. He didn't care if she was young. To him, this girl was another example of laziness. He looked her up and down, his eyes cold. "Why don't you go find a job instead of begging on the street?" he snapped, his voice filled with disdain. "People like you are always looking for handouts." The girl's expression faltered, a brief shadow of hurt crossing her face. But she quickly straightened her posture, her gaze steady. I would if I could. It's complicated," Mark scoffed, waving his hand dismissively. "Everything's always complicated, isn't it? You can find an excuse for anything if you try hard enough." Without waiting for her response, he turned and continued toward his car, feeling a strange sense of satisfaction at putting her in her place. He prided himself on his tough love approach, convinced that sometimes people needed a reality check. Mark believed he was doing her a favor by showing her that the world was a tough place. As he settled into his car, he cast a final glance in her direction. She was still standing there, her shoulders tense, watching him leave. For a fleeting moment, he thought he saw something familiar in her eyes, a depth that didn't match her young face. But he quickly dismissed it as nothing more than a trick of the light. The girl, however, left an odd impression on him. Even as he drove away, her image lingered in his mind, and he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that there was more to her than met the eye. Later that afternoon, Mark met Paul for lunch at an upscale restaurant downtown. Their conversation started with the usual topics: business, investments, and upcoming projects. But after a while, Paul's tone grew somber, and he glanced around as if to make sure no one was listening. "Mark, there's something I haven't told you," Paul began, his voice barely above a whisper. Mark raised an eyebrow, intrigued. It wasn't like Paul to be mysterious. "What's going on?" Paul hesitated, his gaze fixed on the table. "I have a daughter. I lost track of her years ago. Her mother and I went through a rough time, and she took our daughter away without telling me where. I've spent years trying to find her." Mark stared at his friend, taken aback by this revelation. He had never imagined that Paul, the seemingly unbreakable man who thrived on control, had such a vulnerable part of his life. "Why are you telling me this now?" he asked softly. "Because I finally found her," Paul said, his voice filled with emotion. "Or rather, I have a lead. She's been seen downtown, around the same area as your office. I think she might be living on the streets." A chill ran through Mark as he recalled the girl he had seen earlier. The girl with the intense, defiant eyes. Could it be? The realization hit him with a force he wasn't prepared for. "Paul, this girl, your daughter," he said slowly, his mind racing. "How old is she?" 13, Paul replied, a flicker of hope in his voice. "Why?" Mark took a shaky breath, his arrogance suddenly replaced by a gnawing guilt. I think I saw her today, outside my office. She asked me for help, and I turned her away." Paul's face fell, a mix of disappointment and understanding in his eyes. "You didn't know, Mark, and maybe this is fate's way of giving you a second chance." Mark nodded, the weight of his actions settling on him. He thought back to the look on her face, the hurt hidden behind her defiance, and he felt a pang of regret he hadn't expected. For the first time in a long while, Mark was forced to confront a part of himself he had ignored. A part that saw people as more than just statistics or obstacles. "I need to make this right," he murmured, more to himself than to Paul. Paul reached across the table, placing a reassuring hand on his friend's arm. "Then go find her, Mark. Help her. Show her that not everyone will turn their back on her." As Mark left the restaurant, he felt a new resolve brewing within him. He would find the girl, find Sara, and make amends. The journey to redemption had begun, and Mark knew it would be a path as challenging as any business deal he had ever closed. But this time, the stakes were personal, and failure was not an option. Before we continue with this heartwarming story, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. This is how you can contribute and help us continue bringing meaningful stories about justice and overcoming challenges. Click the subscribe button now and turn on notifications so you don't miss what's coming next. Let's keep going. The next morning, Mark arrived at his office early, his mind still racing from the conversation he had had with Paul. He couldn't shake the image of the young girl from his thoughts. Her dark eyes, the defiance in her expression, and the subtle pain that lingered behind her brave front. He felt a wave of unease wash over him. He had never felt such a pressing need to undo a mistake. As he made his way through the lobby, his assistant, Julia, greeted him. "Good morning, Mr. Delaney," she said. But her words barely registered as Mark brushed past her, mumbling a faint reply. He exited the building quickly, his gaze sweeping over the street in search of Sara. The early morning sun cast a warm glow over the city, and the scent of fresh coffee drifted from a nearby cafe. People bustled about, some headed to work, others stopping to chat or check their phones, unaware of Mark's internal turmoil. He was desperate to find her and apologize, hoping he hadn't missed his chance. Then, he saw her. Sara was sitting on a bench, looking lost in thought as she held a small, crumpled paper bag. Her fingers traced the edges absent-mindedly, and her eyes were focused somewhere far away, as if she were trying to escape her current reality. Mark's heart pounded as he approached her, nerves tightening in his stomach. Clearing his throat, he stopped a few feet from the bench. "Hey," he said, his voice softer than usual. "Do you remember me?" Sara looked up, her expression wary. Recognition flickered in her eyes, but it was quickly replaced by caution. "Yeah, I remember you," she replied, her voice edged with bitterness. "You're the guy who told me to go find a job?" Mark winced, feeling the sting of her words. "Listen, about that, I was wrong. I shouldn't have spoken to you like that. Sara folded her arms, her gaze unwavering. Why are you here? To tell me I'm lazy again? Mark took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. No, I came here because I made a mistake, and I want to make it right. Make it right? She repeated, her voice dripping with skepticism. How exactly do you plan to do that? Give me some pity money to make yourself feel better? Mark flinched, but he knew he deserved her anger. He had spoken to her with such cruelty, and now he was facing the consequences. I don't want to give you money. I just want to understand. Sara looked at him, her eyes narrowing. Understand what? That sometimes people end up on the street for reasons they can't control? That not everyone has a choice? Her words hit him harder than he had anticipated. Yes, I want to understand that, he replied quietly. I know I haven't lived a life like yours. I don't know what you're going through. Sara laughed bitterly, shaking her head. You have no idea, do you? Her voice softened, but it was still filled with pain. People like you think we're just lazy, that we don't try hard enough. You don't see what it's like. Mark swallowed, feeling a pang of shame. You're right. I've lived my life thinking success is all about working hard. But maybe I was wrong. Maybe, she challenged, her voice rising. Do you have any idea how many people have turned me away just because they think I don't deserve help? How many people look at me and assume I'm not worth their time? Mark felt his throat tighten. He hadn't realized how much weight his words had carried until now. I'm sorry, Sara, he murmured. I really am. At the sound of her name, Sara froze. She looked at him, confusion etched on her face. How do you know my name? Mark hesitated, unsure how much he should reveal. I talked to a friend of mine yesterday. His name is Paul Mitchell. The color drained from Sara's face, and her expression shifted from anger to shock. Paul, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Her hands trembled as she clutched the paper bag tighter. Why would you talk to him? Because he's been looking for you, Mark said softly. He's been searching for you for years. Sara's eyes filled with tears, and she looked away, trying to compose herself. I don't know if I believe you. Why would he care now, after all this time? Mark took a seat on the bench beside her, maintaining a respectful distance. Sometimes life gets complicated. People make mistakes. But he does care, Sara. He's been heartbroken, not knowing where you are or if you're okay. Sara's shoulders sagged, and for a moment, she looked much younger than 13, like a little girl lost in a world too big and too harsh for her. I thought he forgot about me, she whispered. I thought he didn't want me. Mark felt a pang of guilt, realizing how wrong he had been in his assumptions about her. This was no ordinary child. She had been through things most adults couldn't imagine. I don't think he ever stopped wanting you, Sara. She glanced at him, her eyes red and glistening. And what about you? She asked, her tone laced with accusation. Do you feel better now that you're sitting here trying to fix what you did? Mark looked down, the weight of her question pressing on him. No, I don't feel better. I feel ashamed. I didn't understand your situation, and I acted like a fool. There was a long pause, the sounds of the city filling the silence between them. Sara looked at him, her face unreadable, before speaking again. Why should I trust you? She asked, her voice trembling slightly. How do I know you're not just saying this to make yourself feel better? Mark sighed, realizing that trust wasn't something he could earn with words alone. You don't know, and I can't make you believe me, but I promise, I'm here to help. I'll do whatever it takes. Sara studied him, the intensity in her gaze unwavering. Finally, she nodded, a small gesture that seemed to carry a weight of its own. Fine, but I don't need your pity. If you want to help me, prove it. Mark felt a surge of determination. I will, he promised, his voice filled with conviction. Whatever you need, I'll be there. The tension in Sara's posture softened, just a bit, and for the first time, there was a flicker of hope in her eyes. Maybe, she said quietly, maybe this time, someone will keep their word. As Mark walked away from the encounter, he felt a strange mixture of relief and anxiety. The road to redemption was long, and he knew this was only the beginning. But he had made a promise, and for the first time, he felt ready to keep it, no matter what it took. Mark couldn't shake the feeling that he had crossed a boundary. His encounter with Sara had opened a door into a world he had never truly understood. That night, sleep was elusive, and he found himself awake at dawn, his mind racing with plans on how he could make things right. His friend Paul had no idea what he had been through the previous day. He had to tell him. Paul deserved to know that his daughter was out there, vulnerable and alone. Later that morning, Mark called Paul. He felt a knot in his stomach as he waited for his friend to pick up, rehearsing what he was going to say. Finally, Paul answered, his voice filled with his usual energy. "Mark, good morning, my friend. To what do I owe the pleasure?" Paul's tone was cheerful, oblivious to the weight of Mark's call. "Paul, I found her," Mark began, his voice low and serious. "I found Sara. She was right outside my office, asking for help." There was a stunned silence on the other end of the line, and when Paul finally spoke, his voice was a whisper. Are you sure?" Mark took a deep breath. "Yes, I spoke to her. She's angry, hurt, but she's alive, Paul. She's out there, and she needs us." Paul's silence grew thick with emotion, and Mark could imagine the shock, the joy, and the pain that must be coursing through his friend. After a few moments, Paul let out a shaky breath. I don't know what to say. I've looked for her everywhere. I can't believe she was so close all this time." "I know," Mark replied softly, "but Paul, she doesn't trust me. I think she's had it rough, and I didn't exactly help with my attitude when I first met her. I was harsh." Paul's voice grew tense. "What did you say to her, Mark?" Mark closed his eyes, feeling a pang of guilt. "I told her to get a job instead of begging. I didn't know, Paul. I had no idea she was your daughter, that she had been through so much. But I'm trying to fix it now. I'm meeting with her again today. I want you to come." Paul's tone softened, but there was still an edge to it. "Fine, but Mark, don't let me down on this. She's all I have left." Mark's chest tightened, and he nodded, even though Paul couldn't see him. "I won't let you down. We'll do this together." That afternoon, Mark and Paul made their way back to the bench where Mark had last seen Sara. The sun was beginning to dip behind the skyscrapers, casting long shadows across the street. Paul's expression was a mixture of hope and anxiety as he scanned the area, his hands clenching and unclenching. "Do you think she'll be here?" Paul asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I hope so," Mark replied, his gaze fixed on the spot where Sara had sat the day before. As they approached, they saw her. Sara was sitting on the same bench, her posture tense, her eyes watching the crowd around her. She looked tired, her face etched with a sadness that seemed far too heavy for a girl her age. Paul's breath caught, and he reached out to steady himself against Mark's shoulder. "That's her," he whispered, his voice trembling. "That's my daughter." Mark placed a reassuring hand on his friend's back. "Take it slow, Paul. She's been through a lot." As they walked closer, Sara noticed them, her expression immediately hardening. She stood up, crossing her arms defensively. "You again," she said to Mark, her tone laced with irritation. "What? Did you bring backup this time?" Mark raised his hands in a gesture of peace. "Sara, I just want you to meet someone. This is Paul." Paul stepped forward, his face filled with emotion. "Sara, I'm your father." Sara's eyes widened, and she took a step back, shaking her head. No, you can't be. My father left me. He didn't want me." Paul's face crumpled, and he reached out a hand, though he didn't move any closer. "I did want you, Sara. I never stopped wanting you. I looked for you everywhere. I tried so hard to find you." Sara's jaw clenched, her fists tightening at her sides. "If you wanted me so much, why did you leave me in the first place?" Paul's eyes filled with tears. "It wasn't by choice. Your mother. She left, and she took you with her. I tried to find you, but I didn't know where to look." Sara's gaze flickered between anger and confusion, and she took a shaky breath. "I waited, I waited for years, thinking maybe you'd come find me. But you never did." Mark felt his heart ache as he watched them, realizing the depth of Sara's pain. He took a step back, allowing Paul and Sara the space they needed, but he remained close enough to intervene if things got too intense. "Sara," Paul said, his voice barely holding together. "I know I failed you. I can't change what happened, but I'm here now, and I want to make things right." Sara crossed her arms, her face hardening again. "How do I know you won't just leave again?" "Everyone does." Paul shook his head, taking a tentative step forward. "I'm not leaving, Sara. Not again. I'll be here, no matter what." There was a tense silence as Sara searched his face, as if trying to decide if she could believe him. Finally, she took a deep breath and looked away, her voice barely a whisper. "Fine. You can stay for now." Paul's face lit up with a mixture of relief and hope. "Thank you, Sara. That's all I want." Mark stepped forward cautiously, sensing that the worst of the storm had passed. "Sara, if there's anything you need, anything at all, we're here to help." She looked at him, her expression unreadable. "I don't need your help. I can take care of myself." Paul nodded, understanding the pride and hurt behind her words. "I know you can. You've been strong on your own for a long time, but you don't have to do it alone anymore." Sara's defenses seemed to soften, and she gave a small nod, her face thoughtful. "We'll see," she said quietly, glancing between Paul and Mark. "But don't expect me to just trust you right away. Trust takes time." Paul smiled softly, nodding in agreement. "I wouldn't expect anything less. Take all the time you need, Sara." As they began to talk, the setting sun bathed them in a warm glow, and for the first time in years, Paul felt a flicker of hope. He knew that healing would be a long process, but he was ready to walk that path with his daughter. Mark watched them, feeling a surge of gratitude that he had been given the chance to be a part of this moment. He had entered this situation as an outsider, but now he was a witness to the beginning of something powerful, a father and daughter taking the first steps toward forgiveness and reconciliation. And in that quiet moment, as they shared tentative smiles and hesitant words, Mark understood that his life had changed forever. In the days that followed, Paul was determined to establish a connection with Sara, no matter how slow or challenging it might be. He wanted to show her that his intentions were genuine, that he was here to stay, despite all the years lost. Mark, equally committed, took a step back but remained close, knowing he had opened a door that was never meant to be closed. One afternoon, Paul suggested meeting in a small, quiet park just a few blocks from his apartment. He chose the spot carefully. It was a peaceful place with shaded trees and a pond that reflected the sky, a stark contrast to the cold streets Sara had been used to. He hoped the calm setting would make her feel at ease, safe enough to open up, even if just a little. As Paul and Mark waited on a wooden bench by the pond, Paul glanced at his watch, his fingers tapping nervously against his knee. "What if she doesn't come?" he murmured, his voice barely audible. Mark placed a hand on his shoulder, giving it a reassuring squeeze. "She'll come, Paul. Just give her time. This isn't easy for her." Paul nodded, though his eyes remained fixed on the path leading to the bench. The sun was low in the sky, casting a warm, golden light over the park. Birds chirped in the trees, and the scent of blooming flowers filled the air, a reminder of a gentler world outside the turmoil they were living. After a few tense minutes, a figure appeared on the path. Sara, with her head held high and her hands buried in her pockets, walked toward them. She wore the same guarded expression, but there was a slight shift in her gaze as she saw Paul and Mark waiting for her. Paul stood up, his heart pounding. "Sara, you came," he said, his voice breaking slightly. Sara shrugged, stopping a few feet away from them. "I said I'd think about it. Didn't mean I was going to keep showing up." Paul smiled, his eyes shining with relief. "I'm just glad you're here. That's all that matters." Mark gestured to the empty space on the bench beside him. "There's a spot here if you'd like to sit." Sara eyed the bench suspiciously before finally sitting down, though she kept a small distance between herself and the two men. She crossed her arms, her expression cautious. "So, what's this about? You both wanted a nice view, while you tell me how sorry you are." Paul took a deep breath, nodding. "I am sorry, Sara. I wish I could change the past. I know it's not enough to just say it, but I want to be part of your life, however you'll let me." Sara stared at him, her eyes narrowing. Why now? After all these years? Why didn't you look harder? Paul's face softened, a look of regret etched in his features. I did, Sara. I tried everything I could. I hired investigators, asked anyone who might know. But your mother made it difficult. She didn't want me to find you. Sara clenched her jaw, her gaze dropping to the ground. I waited for you to come find me. Mark, sensing the weight of her words, leaned forward. Sara, sometimes life isn't as straightforward as it should be. Your father. He never stopped searching. She shot him a sharp look. You say that like you know him so well? Like you know what it's like to be left behind? Mark paused, feeling the tension in her gaze. I don't know what it's like, Sara, but I know your father, and I know he's here for the right reasons. Paul nodded, his voice barely above a whisper. I'm here, Sara, and I'm not going anywhere. Sara exhaled, looking out at the pond, her face a mixture of frustration and sadness. I've been on my own for so long. I don't need anyone to come in and try to save me now. Paul swallowed, choosing his words carefully. I don't want to save you, Sara. I want to get to know you, to be here for you however you need me. She was silent for a long moment, and when she finally spoke, her voice was small, almost vulnerable. You don't know what I've been through. You don't know how hard it's been. Paul's eyes filled with tears. Then tell me, Sara. I want to know everything, whatever you're ready to share. I want to understand. For the first time, Sara's expression softened. She looked at Paul, her gaze steady but filled with a hesitation that spoke of years of hidden pain. You really want to know? Paul nodded, his voice barely a whisper. Yes, Sara, I do. She looked down at her hands, her fingers twisting together as if searching for strength. It's been hard. Living on the streets isn't just about not having a home. It's about people looking at you like you're nothing, like you don't belong. I've had to fight just to keep myself safe. I've had to beg sometimes just to survive. Paul's face contorted with pain. I'm so sorry, Sara. I can't imagine what you've been through. Sara's gaze turned distant. Sometimes, people were kind. There were days when someone would give me food or a little money. But most of the time, people looked right through me as if I didn't exist. Or worse, they'd treat me like dirt, just like he did. She glanced at Mark, her expression hard. Mark's chest tightened, the weight of his previous actions pressing on him. Sara, I was wrong. I don't know what I was thinking. All I can say is that I'm sorry, and I want to make it up to you. She looked at him, her eyes searching. You can't just make it up. You don't know what it's like to be looked down on, to feel like you're less than everyone around you. Mark swallowed, his throat tight. You're right. I don't know, but I can learn, if you'll let me. I want to be there for you, just like Paul. Sara looked between the two men, her face a mixture of hurt and a small glimmer of hope. I don't know if I can trust either of you, but maybe I can try. Paul's face lit up with a cautious smile. That's all I could ever ask, Sara. Just give me a chance. There was a long silence as they all sat by the pond, the sound of water lapping against the shore filling the quiet between them. The golden light of the setting sun cast a warm glow over the three, bathing them in a moment that felt strangely peaceful, yet fragile. Sara glanced at the pond, her expression thoughtful. I used to come here, before everything happened. My mom and I would come here and feed the ducks. Paul's face softened, a memory lighting up in his eyes. I remember that. I used to take you here when you were little. You'd laugh every time the ducks came close. Sara's face softened for a brief second, her lips curving into a small, hesitant smile. Yeah, I remember. For a moment, the wall around her seemed to crack, just enough for Paul and Mark to glimpse the girl behind the hurt. And as they sat in the soft glow of the fading day, there was a sense of possibility, a chance that maybe, just maybe, healing was possible. As the days passed, Sara met Paul and Mark in the park a few more times. Each time, the tension softened just a bit, but she remained guarded, despite her cautious willingness to be there. An invisible wall still stood between her and them, a defense built from years of hardship and mistrust. Both Paul and Mark could sense it, and they respected her space, but the weight of the past still lingered. One afternoon, after one of their quiet gatherings at the park, Paul invited Sara to have dinner with him at a small cafe nearby. It was a cozy, tucked-away place with wooden tables and warm lighting, a stark contrast to the cold and busy streets where Sara had spent so much of her time. Paul chose a table by the window, hoping the gentle environment would make Sara feel comfortable. As they settled into their seats, a waitress came over with a smile, placing menus on the table. "Hi, my name's Claire. I'll be your server tonight. Can I get you something to drink?" Paul glanced at Sara, waiting for her to answer. She hesitated, her fingers tracing the edge of the menu, as if unfamiliar with the luxury of ordering anything she wanted. I'll just have water," she said quietly, not meeting the waitress's eyes. Paul ordered a coffee for himself and then looked at Sara with a gentle smile. "You can order whatever you like, Sara. Anything on the menu." She glanced up at him, uncertainty flickering in her gaze. I don't want to take advantage." Paul leaned forward, his voice soft. "You're not taking advantage. This is my treat. I'm just happy you're here with me." Sara nodded slowly, but she still looked uncomfortable. As the waitress returned with their drinks, she reluctantly ordered a sandwich, her voice barely above a whisper. Paul watched her, sensing the tension radiating from her. "Sara, I know this is all new to you, and I know you're still not sure about me or any of this, but I want you to know that I'm here, no matter how long it takes." Sara took a sip of her water, her gaze fixed on the table. "It's not just that, Paul. It's everything. I've been on my own for so long, and now you're here and Mark too. It's just strange." Paul nodded, understanding. "I get it. I can't imagine what it must be like for you. But I'm here to listen whenever you're ready." Before Sara could respond, a figure approached their table. A man in a suit with a sharp gaze and a confident smirk. He looked down at Sara, his eyes narrowing. Well, what do we have here?" he sneered, crossing his arms. "I thought you were smarter than this, Paul. Bringing an stray like her?" Paul's face darkened, his eyes flashing with anger. "Excuse me, Patrick, but I don't think this is any of your business." Patrick scoffed, his gaze lingering on Sara with a disdainful look. "She doesn't look like she belongs here, Paul. I mean, really? A street kid in a place like this? You're just asking for trouble." Sara's face flushed with a mixture of anger and humiliation. Her hands clenched tightly around her glass, and she looked down, avoiding Patrick's gaze. She was used to being judged, but somehow, hearing it here, in front of her father, felt sharper, more painful. Paul stood, his tone icy. "I think you should leave, Patrick. Now." Patrick laughed, ignoring Paul's warning. "Come on, Paul. You know I'm right. People like her. They don't belong with us. They're nothing but trouble." Sara's fists tightened, and she could feel her heart racing, her body tense with the urge to defend herself. But a part of her held back, afraid of making a scene, afraid of proving Patrick right. Paul reached out, placing a protective hand on Sara's shoulder. "She's my daughter, Patrick, and she has every right to be here." Patrick's sneer faltered for a brief moment, surprise flickering in his eyes. But he quickly recovered, shaking his head. "Your daughter? Oh, Paul, I didn't realize you'd fallen so low. Taking in some lost kid from the streets? You're better than that." Paul took a step closer to Patrick, his voice low and dangerous. "I don't need your approval, Patrick, and I won't stand here and listen to you insult my daughter." Patrick shrugged, raising his hands in a mocking gesture of surrender. "Fine, suit yourself. But don't say I didn't warn you when she ends up causing you more trouble than she's worth." With a final sneer, Patrick turned and walked away, leaving a tense silence at the table. Sara stared at her hands, her face pale and her eyes filled with a mixture of anger and shame. She didn't want Paul to see her like this, humiliated, exposed. Paul sat back down, his face still tight with anger. "Sara, I'm so sorry. He had no right to speak to you that way." Sara shook her head, her voice barely a whisper. It's fine. I'm used to it. Paul's heart broke at her words. He reached across the table, gently touching her hand. You shouldn't have to be. No one should ever make you feel that way. Sara pulled her hand away, her face hardening. That's the thing, though. People like him. They're everywhere. It doesn't matter where I go. I'll always be less to them. Paul's eyes softened, and he took a deep breath. Not to me, Sara. To me, you're my daughter. And nothing he or anyone else says can change that. She looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of pain and vulnerability. You say that now, but what about later? When it gets hard, when people keep looking at me like I'm nothing? Paul's expression didn't waver. Then I'll stand by you every single time, no matter how hard it gets. Sara's lip quivered, and for a moment, she seemed on the verge of tears. But she quickly blinked them away, her face becoming impassive once more. I don't need you to fight my battles. I've been doing that on my own for a long time. Paul nodded, respecting her strength. I know, but you don't have to do it alone anymore. I'm here, whether you want me to be or not. There was a long silence, the tension slowly easing as they finished their meal. But the weight of Patrick's words lingered in the air, an ugly reminder of the world that Sara had to face every day. As they left the cafe, Paul placed a gentle hand on Sara's shoulder. I'm proud of you, Sara, for everything you've been through, for standing strong. You have a strength that not many people have. Sara didn't respond, but as they walked together through the quiet streets, there was a slight shift in her posture, a subtle lift in her shoulders. For the first time, she allowed herself to feel the weight of Paul's words, to believe that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't alone. After the incident at the cafe, Sara found herself wrestling with a tangle of emotions she didn't quite understand. Patrick's cruel words echoed in her mind, amplifying her lingering doubts and fears. She had always been resilient, learning to brush off the judgments and sneers from strangers. But something about the way Patrick had humiliated her, right in front of her father, felt different. It was as though her vulnerability had been put on display, and she hated it. A few days later, Paul suggested that they meet at his apartment for dinner. He had prepared a simple meal, nothing extravagant, hoping the familiar, cozy setting would allow Sara to feel more at ease. As she entered, she noticed the subtle touches: a stack of books in the corner, a worn-out leather couch, and a family photo on the wall. It was a glimpse into a life she had been separated from, and though she'd never admit it, a small part of her wondered what it might have been like to grow up here. Make yourself at home, Paul said, offering her a warm smile as he placed a steaming pot of pasta on the table. I hope you're hungry. Sara sat down at the table, her gaze scanning the apartment. I don't know. I guess I expected something fancier. Paul laughed, a sound that felt both foreign and familiar to her. I'm not as fancy as you think. I like to keep things simple. It helps me remember what's important. She looked at him, curiosity flickering in her eyes. Like what? Like family, he said softly, his gaze meeting hers. People, memories, things that really matter. Sara felt a pang in her chest, a reminder of all the moments she had missed, all the years spent without this kind of warmth. She glanced down at her plate, pushing a piece of pasta around with her fork. I wouldn't know much about that, she muttered. Paul's face softened, his voice gentle. I'm sorry, Sara. I wish I could turn back time, make things different for you. But I'm here now, and I want to make the most of whatever time we have. Sara gave a half-hearted shrug, refusing to let her guard down. People say things like that, but they don't really mean it. It's just words. Paul sighed, his hand resting on the table between them. It's not just words to me, Sara. I know I have a lot to prove to you, and I'm willing to do it, no matter how long it takes. They ate in silence for a few moments, the quiet punctuated only by the clinking of forks against plates. The warmth of the food and the dim lighting in the apartment created a cocoon of intimacy, but Sara's thoughts remained distant, tangled with questions and doubts. Finally, she looked up, her voice hesitant. Why did you let Patrick talk to me like that? Why didn't you? I don't know. Stop him sooner? Paul's expression shifted, guilt darkening his eyes. I was in shock, Sara. It took me a moment to realize how horrible he was being. And honestly, I felt ashamed. Ashamed that someone I once called a friend could act that way. Sara's gaze hardened, her voice edged with frustration. It's like you don't even know what people really think of me. People like Patrick think I'm just trash. And you're all surprised when they say it out loud. Paul reached across the table, his hand hovering for a moment before he placed it gently over hers. Sara, you're not trash. You're my daughter, and I'll spend the rest of my life proving to you that you're worth so much more than any of those people could ever understand. She pulled her hand away, her jaw set. You can say that all you want, but it doesn't change how they see me, or how I feel. Paul's face softened, but he didn't push her. I understand, Sara, and I won't pretend I know what it's like to feel that way. But you don't have to go through it alone. She looked away, her voice barely above a whisper. Sometimes I think it's easier to just be on my own. At least then, I don't have to worry about disappointing anyone or letting anyone down. Paul's expression was pained, his heart breaking at her words. Sara, you could never disappoint me. You're stronger than anyone I know. And if there's one thing I want you to believe, it's that I'm here to stay. She let out a bitter laugh. You say that now, but when things get hard, when it's not convenient, that's when people leave. Paul's eyes filled with determination. I won't leave. Not again. I made that mistake once, and I'll never make it again. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of his words settling between them. Sara could feel the sincerity in his tone, but the scars of her past held her back, a constant reminder that trust was a dangerous thing to give. Mark's voice came from the doorway as he stepped into the apartment, carrying a few bags. Am I interrupting? Sara looked up, a flicker of annoyance crossing her face. Why are you here? Mark set the bags down on the counter, offering her a small smile. I brought dessert. Thought we could have something sweet after dinner. If that's all right with you. Sara rolled her eyes, but there was a faint hint of amusement in her expression. Fine. Whatever. Mark unpacked a box of chocolate cake, setting it on the table. You know, Sara, sometimes a bit of sweetness can make even the toughest day feel better. At least, that's what I tell myself. She raised an eyebrow, her tone skeptical. You think chocolate cake can fix everything? Mark shrugged, a playful glint in his eyes. Maybe not everything, but it's a good start. Paul chuckled, cutting a slice of the cake and placing it on a plate in front of Sara. Just try it. You might be surprised. Sara took a small bite, her expression softening as the rich chocolate melted in her mouth. For a brief moment, her guarded facade slipped, and a genuine smile broke through. But it was gone as quickly as it had appeared, replaced once more by her cautious gaze. Mark watched her, his voice gentle. You know, Sara, I get it. I've made mistakes, big ones, and I know it'll take time for you to forgive me. But I'm here because I want to be, not because I have to. Sara put down her fork, looking at him with a mixture of anger and sadness. You don't know what it's like, Mark. You and Paul, you don't get it. I've had to fight for everything, and now you both just show up, like you can make it all go away with cake and apologies. Paul's face fell, but he nodded, understanding her frustration. You're right, Sara. We can't change the past, and we can't erase what you've been through. But we can be here for you now, in whatever way you'll let us. Sara's voice softened, her anger fading into exhaustion. I don't know if I can just let you in. It's not that easy. Mark nodded, his gaze steady. We don't expect it to be easy. All we ask is that you give us a chance, just one step at a time. She looked at them both, her defenses slowly crumbling. I'll try. But don't expect me to trust you right away. Paul's eyes shone with relief, and he reached out, squeezing her hand gently. That's all we ask, Sara. Just a chance. As they sat together, sharing quiet conversation over dessert, there was a shift in the air. A sense of tentative hope, fragile but real. For the first time, Sara allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't as alone as she had thought. Sara found herself returning to Paul's apartment more frequently. Though she didn't yet feel entirely at ease, she sensed that something genuine lay in Paul and Mark's intentions. They weren't perfect, and she was still guarded, but a small, cautious hope began to bloom within her, a glimmer of the family she had longed for. However, that fragile hope was about to face its first real test. One evening, Paul invited her over for dinner once again, and this time, he had planned something special. When Sara entered the apartment, she noticed the table set beautifully with candles, flowers, and a spread of her favorite dishes, which Paul had spent the entire afternoon preparing after carefully asking her about her preferences. "You did all this for me?" Sara asked, a hint of disbelief in her voice as she scanned the table. Paul nodded, his eyes bright with a mix of excitement and nervousness. "Of course. You're worth every minute, Sara. I wanted to make tonight special." Sara's expression softened, and for a moment, her usual defensive demeanor melted away. She looked down, hiding a small, genuine smile. "Thank you. I've never had anyone do something like this for me before." Paul's face lit up, visibly moved by her words. "Well, get used to it. This is just the beginning. You deserve every bit of it." They sat down to eat, and as they shared stories, Paul did his best to coax Sara into talking about her life, her dreams, and her favorite things. She answered in small snippets, giving him just enough to show she was trying, even if the details were sparse. Mark joined them after a while, his presence bringing a relaxed, almost familial dynamic to the table. In the warmth of the evening, with laughter and the rich aroma of home-cooked food filling the air, Sara felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. She felt seen, valued, like she truly belonged. A cautious optimism began to stir within her, as if maybe, just maybe, she could have a place here. But that sense of belonging was short-lived. After dinner, while they were clearing the dishes, there was a knock on the door. Paul opened it, and in walked Patrick, the same man who had humiliated Sara at the cafe. She froze, a chill running down her spine as her eyes met his. Patrick sneered, his gaze settling on Sara with a mix of disdain and amusement. "Well, isn't this cozy? I didn't realize you turned your home into a shelter, Paul." Paul's face darkened, but before he could respond, Mark stepped forward, his voice low and firm. "Patrick, I think you should leave." Patrick raised his hands in mock surrender, smirking. "Relax, I just came to talk. Didn't expect to find company." Sara's shoulders tensed, and she took a step back, trying to make herself as small as possible. The warmth she had felt moments before was quickly replaced by a cold, familiar fear. A reminder that this was the world she knew too well, where people like Patrick looked down on her, reminding her of the life she was trying to escape. Paul moved to her side, his voice steady but strained. "Patrick, this is my daughter, and I won't tolerate any disrespect." Patrick's eyes widened in mock surprise. "Daughter? Oh, Paul, come on. You really expect me to believe that?" Mark clenched his fists, his voice a growl. "She's his daughter, and she's family. I'd suggest you watch your mouth." Patrick scoffed, a laugh escaping his lips. "This is priceless. You're really going to stand there and pretend this street kid is your family? I mean, look at her. She's not one of us." The room went silent, the air thick with tension. Paul's face turned pale, and he glanced at Sara, whose expression had shifted from fear to anger. Her hands were balled into fists, and her body was tense, but she held her ground, her gaze steady. "Maybe I'm not one of you," she said, her voice steady, though her hands trembled slightly, "but at least I don't judge people based on where they come from." Patrick's smirk faltered for a second before he regained his composure, looking at Paul with a mixture of pity and disgust. "Paul, listen to yourself. You're throwing everything away for this? For someone who doesn't even belong here." Paul's face tightened, his voice icy. "Get out, Patrick. I don't want you in my home." Patrick laughed, shaking his head. "Fine, but don't come crying to me when this little experiment of yours falls apart. Some things don't change, Paul, and people like her, they don't fit in our world." With a final sneer, Patrick turned and left, slamming the door behind him. The sound echoed through the apartment, leaving a suffocating silence in its wake. Sara's gaze dropped to the floor, her earlier confidence fading as doubt and shame crept back into her expression. Paul moved to her side, reaching out a hand. "Sara, don't listen to him. He doesn't know you. He doesn't know anything." But Sara pulled away, her shoulders stiffening. "Maybe he's right, Paul. Maybe I don't belong here. People are always going to look at me that way. Like I'm nothing." Mark stepped closer, his voice firm but gentle. "Sara, you're not nothing. You're strong, and you're worth more than people like Patrick can ever understand." She looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of anger and hurt. "You say that now, but people like you, people like Patrick, you'll never really see me as equal. I'm just some charity case to you." Paul's face filled with anguish. "Sara, please, that's not true. You're not a charity case. You're my daughter, and I love you." Sara let out a bitter laugh, stepping back further. "Love? You don't even know me. You think a few dinners and kind words make up for everything?" Paul's eyes shone with unshed tears. "I know it doesn't make up for anything. I know it'll take time, but I want to try, Sara. Please, just give me a chance." But Sara shook her head, the wall she had begun to lower suddenly building back up, higher and stronger than before. "I can't do this, Paul. I thought maybe things could be different, but I was wrong." She turned to leave, her movements quick and determined, her face set in an expression of pain and frustration. Paul took a step forward, his hand reaching out, but he stopped himself, a look of desperation crossing his face. "Sara, please," he called out, his voice breaking. "Don't go." But she didn't stop. She reached the door, casting one last glance over her shoulder. Her expression hardened. This was a mistake. And with that, she walked out, leaving Paul and Mark standing in the silent, empty apartment, the remnants of their warm evening shattered like broken glass. Mark put a hand on Paul's shoulder, his voice quiet. "Give her time. She needs to figure this out on her own." Paul nodded, his gaze fixed on the closed door, a tear slipping down his cheek. I just wanted her to feel loved." Mark sighed, his own heart heavy with guilt and regret. "She'll come back. She's strong, Paul, and she knows, deep down, that you care." But as the evening faded into night, both men were left with the bitter ache of watching someone they loved slip through their fingers, unsure if they would ever get the chance to make things right. After Sara's departure, Paul found himself haunted by her words and the harsh impact of Patrick's cruelty. Days turned into a week, and he hadn't heard from her. Despite the calls and texts he had sent, the silence weighed heavily on him, filling his once quiet apartment with a sense of emptiness and failure. Mark, seeing his friend's despair, suggested they visit Patrick at his office. He had a feeling that Patrick's venomous words weren't merely born out of ignorance or casual disdain. Perhaps there was something deeper, something that Paul needed to understand if he ever wanted to repair the fractured relationship with his daughter. They arrived at Patrick's office building in the financial district, a towering structure of glass and steel that epitomized the ruthless world they both worked in. As they entered the grand lobby, Mark glanced at Paul, whose face was set with a determined expression. "I know this is difficult, Paul," Mark said quietly, resting a hand on his friend's shoulder. "But maybe confronting him will give you some clarity." Paul nodded, his jaw clenched. "He's always been intense, but I never thought he'd be capable of such cruelty." They were directed up to the 20th floor, where Patrick's corner office overlooked the city skyline. When they entered, Patrick was leaning back in his leather chair, his fingers steepled together, a smug smile already on his face as if he had been expecting them. Well, Patrick drawled, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "What brings the two of you here? A father-daughter reunion didn't go as planned?" Paul took a deep breath, steadying himself. "I'm here to understand, Patrick. Why would you say those things to Sara? What could possibly justify that kind of behavior?" Patrick's smirk only deepened. "Justify? I don't have to justify anything, Paul. I was merely being honest. Someone had to tell you the truth." Mark stepped forward, his fists clenched. "What truth, Patrick? That you have no respect for people you consider beneath you? That you think a child is somehow inferior because of her background?" Patrick shrugged, his gaze cold and calculating. I'm just practical, Mark. You both know the kind of world we live in. People like Sara, they don't belong in our circles. They don't have the pedigree, the upbringing. It's a harsh reality, but it's the truth. Paul's eyes filled with a mixture of anger and hurt. She's my daughter, Patrick. That should be enough for you to treat her with basic decency. Patrick leaned forward, his voice suddenly laced with bitterness. Basic decency? Don't talk to me about decency, Paul. Do you know what it's like to fight tooth and nail to get to the top, only to have it threatened by sentimentality, by emotional weakness? Paul's face contorted in confusion. What are you talking about? Patrick's gaze turned cold, and for a brief moment, his mask slipped, revealing a glimpse of the bitterness and resentment that had built up inside him. You think this was easy for me, Paul? You think I didn't make sacrifices? I had to be ruthless to get where I am. And now you want to throw it all away for her. Mark's voice was low, his gaze steady. So that's what this is about. You think caring for Sara is a weakness? Patrick sneered. It is a weakness, Mark. In this world, showing compassion, giving people second chances, it's a luxury we can't afford. People like her will never be grateful. They'll always drag you down, always expect more than you can give. Paul shook his head, disbelief in his eyes. You don't know anything about her, Patrick. She's stronger than you could ever understand. And I don't see her as a burden. I see her as my daughter, someone worth fighting for. Patrick's face twisted with scorn. Keep telling yourself that, Paul. But one day, you'll realize she's just another liability. You'll see the truth the hard way, just like I did. Mark stepped forward, his voice sharp. And what truth is that, Patrick? That people only have value when they can benefit you? That they're disposable when they don't fit your narrow definition of success? Patrick glared at Mark, his expression filled with contempt. You know what, Mark? This is why people like you and Paul will never get it. You cling to these naive ideals, thinking you can change the world by being good. But the real world doesn't work that way. It's brutal, and it doesn't care about your morals or your feelings. Paul took a deep breath, steadying himself. Maybe you're right about the world being brutal, Patrick. But that doesn't mean we have to be. Patrick scoffed, his voice dripping with disdain. Spare me the self-righteous speech, Paul. People don't change. You think your little project with Sara will end any differently? She'll take advantage of you, just like everyone else. Paul shook his head, his eyes filled with sadness. I feel sorry for you, Patrick. You've let this bitterness consume you, and now you can't see anything beyond your own cynicism. Patrick's face tightened, a flicker of vulnerability passing through his eyes before he quickly masked it. Believe what you want, Paul, but don't say I didn't warn you. Mark placed a hand on Paul's shoulder, urging him to leave. We don't have to listen to this, Paul. Let's go. As they turned to leave, Patrick's voice echoed behind them, cold and mocking. You'll regret this, Paul. One day, you'll realize that all your efforts were wasted on someone who doesn't deserve it. Without turning back, Paul replied, his voice steady. I'd rather live with hope and be disappointed than live with bitterness and never know love. They left the office, the tension still heavy between them as they rode down the elevator. Paul was silent, his mind replaying the conversation, while Mark watched him, his expression filled with concern. Finally, as they reached the lobby, Mark spoke. Are you all right? Paul took a deep breath, his gaze distant. I'm not sure. Hearing him say those things, it shook me, but it also made me realize something. Mark tilted his head, waiting for him to continue. What did you realize? That I won't let someone else's bitterness define my relationship with Sara, Paul replied, a new resolve hardening in his eyes. I may have made mistakes in the past, but I won't let Patrick's words cloud my heart. I have a chance to show Sara that not everyone will judge her for where she's been, that there's love beyond this. Cruelty. Mark nodded, a faint smile of admiration on his face. Then let's make sure she knows that. She needs to see it from you more than anyone else. As they walked out of the building, Paul felt a weight lift from his shoulders. He was more determined than ever to reconnect with Sara, to prove to her that he was there not out of obligation but out of love. And for the first time, he felt ready to face whatever obstacles lay ahead, knowing that he had a purpose stronger than any bitterness Patrick could throw his way. After days of silence from Sara, Paul decided to take a step back and give her the space she seemed to need. He hoped she would reach out on her own, though every passing day without word from her made the weight of worry grow heavier in his heart. Meanwhile, Sara struggled with conflicting feelings of resentment, fear, and a flickering hope that she tried desperately to suppress. She hadn't felt connected to anyone in so long, and she feared that allowing herself to trust would only lead to disappointment and pain. One evening, Sara found herself sitting on a bench near the park where she had often met Paul and Mark. She watched people walk by, their faces filled with purpose and belonging, and a pang of loneliness struck her. For all her determination to stay away, she realized she missed them. But she felt as if an invisible wall still stood between her and the life they offered, a life of trust, warmth, and vulnerability. Suddenly, her phone buzzed. She looked down to see a message from an old friend, Jordan, who had also lived on the streets. They hadn't spoken in a while, and seeing his name brought back memories of shared struggles and survival. Part of her wanted to ignore the message, but curiosity got the better of her. "Hey Sara, where have you been? Haven't seen you around. Got a place to crash?" Sara hesitated, then typed a reply. "Yeah, sort of. Just figuring things out." Within moments, Jordan replied, "Don't forget where you come from. Don't let those people change you." His words echoed in her mind, stirring up the fears she'd been trying to bury. She didn't want to lose herself, to become someone who needed others for validation. And yet, her heart ached with a longing she couldn't fully understand. As she was lost in thought, the sound of approaching footsteps caught her attention. Looking up, she saw Mark standing nearby, his face a mixture of surprise and relief. "Sara," he said softly, his voice warm but cautious, as if afraid she might vanish if he spoke too loudly. "I wasn't expecting to see you here." She shrugged, trying to mask her emotions. "Just needed some air." "I didn't know you'd be here." Mark nodded, sitting on the other end of the bench, giving her space. "Yeah, I come here sometimes when I need to think." They sat in silence for a moment, the cool evening breeze rustling the leaves around them. The distant hum of the city filled the air, a constant reminder of the lives and stories that moved around them. Finally, Mark spoke, his tone gentle. "We've missed you, Sara. Paul especially. He's been worried about you." Sara's gaze dropped to the ground, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know if I belong with you guys. It feels strange." Mark leaned forward, his eyes steady. "I understand. I don't expect you to just fit in overnight. And honestly, we're not trying to change you. We just want to know you as you are." She looked up at him, her face softened by the sincerity in his gaze. "That's easy for you to say. You haven't had to live like I have." Mark nodded, his voice filled with understanding. "You're right. I don't know what you've been through, and I can't pretend to understand the things you've seen. But I do know that everyone deserves a chance to have people in their life who care about them." She hesitated, her fingers nervously tracing patterns on the bench. "It's hard to believe that. I've spent so much time taking care of myself, not letting anyone in. It feels safer that way." Mark's expression softened, and he spoke with a quiet conviction. "I know it might feel safer to stay distant, to protect yourself, but sometimes letting people in doesn't make you weaker. It can make you stronger." She laughed bitterly, shaking her head. "You really think that?" "Yes, I do," Mark replied, his voice unwavering. "And Paul feels the same. He's ready to be there for you, whenever you're ready to let him in. But we're not here to push you." Sara's eyes glistened as she looked away, trying to hide the emotion that threatened to surface. "You know, it's been so long since anyone cared. Since anyone even noticed if I was around or not. People like Jordan, they understand me because they've been where I've been. They know what it's like to fight just to survive." Mark watched her, a look of compassion in his eyes. "And I respect that, Sara. I respect your friends and what they mean to you. But I hope you'll allow room for us, too. We don't want to replace anyone in your life. We just want to be a part of it." She looked down at her phone, Jordan's message still visible on the screen. He doesn't trust people like you. He thinks I'll lose myself if I get close to you and Paul. Mark paused, choosing his words carefully. Sara, sometimes people push you away because they're afraid of losing you. And maybe Jordan is scared that if you let us in, he'll lose a friend. She frowned, conflicted. But he's my friend. He's been there for me when no one else was. I don't want to leave him behind. You don't have to leave anyone behind, Sara, Mark replied gently. You're allowed to have different parts of your life, to have friends who understand different parts of you. It doesn't have to be all or nothing. Sara sat quietly, processing his words. There was a truth in what he said, a possibility she hadn't considered. But the thought of letting down her walls, of risking rejection and pain, was terrifying. Mark seemed to sense her hesitation and leaned back, giving her space. You don't have to decide now. Just know that we're here. Whenever you're ready. Sara took a deep breath, looking up at the sky. Stars had begun to peek through the fading light, tiny glimmers of hope in the vast darkness. Maybe I'll try, she murmured, her voice barely audible. Mark smiled softly. That's all we ask, Sara. Just a chance. They sat together in comfortable silence, the weight of their conversation slowly dissolving into the night. For the first time in a long time, Sara felt a sense of calm. The fears and doubts remained, but alongside them was a growing sense of possibility, a tentative belief that maybe, just maybe, she could allow herself to be part of something more. And as they sat under the stars, she let herself imagine a future where she didn't have to choose between survival and connection, where she could belong without losing herself. The next day, after her conversation with Mark, Sara felt a strange mix of anticipation and dread as she wandered through the city streets. She couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental was changing in her life. But with that possibility came fear, a fear of letting herself care, of making herself vulnerable. Lost in thought, Sara turned down an alley and spotted a familiar figure leaning against a brick wall. Jordan stood with his arms crossed, his expression unreadable as he watched her approach. Hey, Sara, he called, a flicker of relief and suspicion in his eyes. Didn't think I'd see you around here again. Sara slowed her steps, her stomach twisting with unease. Yeah, I just needed some time to think. Jordan raised an eyebrow, his voice laced with skepticism. Think? Since when do you have time to think? Or have those new friends of yours convinced you that you're one of them now? Sara flinched at his tone, the accusation stinging. Jordan, it's not like that. They're just trying to help. He scoffed, crossing his arms tighter. Help? They don't know anything about you. They're just playing at being good people because it makes them feel better. And you're letting them. Sara's eyes flashed with a mixture of anger and hurt. That's not fair. They're not like that. Paul, he's my father. He's trying to be there for me. Jordan's expression hardened. So now you're buying into that whole family act? You really think he cares about you after all these years? People like him, they don't change. He's probably just feeling guilty. A flash of anger surged within her, and she stepped closer, her voice firm. You don't know him, Jordan. You don't know what he's been through. And you do, Jordan retorted, his voice sharp. You've known him for what, a few weeks? I've known you for years, Sara. I was there when no one else was. She looked down, guilt twisting her insides. Jordan was right. He had been there for her through so much. But his bitterness, his unwillingness to believe that things could be different, was suffocating. Jordan, I'm not abandoning you, she said quietly. I want to see if there's more out there for me. He laughed, the sound bitter and hollow. More? Sara, there's nothing more for people like us. You're just setting yourself up to be hurt. Again. She shook her head, her frustration bubbling over. I can't live like that, Jordan. I can't keep believing that there's nothing better. Maybe you're okay with giving up, but I'm not. His eyes narrowed, a flicker of betrayal crossing his face. Giving up? You think I've given up? I'm just realistic. I know what the world is like, and I know those people don't care about us. They never have. Sara took a step back, her heart pounding. She could feel the weight of his words pressing down on her, trying to pull her back into the darkness she had fought so hard to escape. "Maybe they don't," she said softly, her voice shaking. "But maybe some people do. I want to find out for myself." Jordan shook his head, his voice low and full of warning. "You're going to regret this, Sara. You're going to get hurt, and when they turn their backs on you, don't come crying to me." She felt tears prick her eyes, but she fought them back, refusing to let him see her pain. "I'm not asking you to understand, Jordan. I just need to see what's out there." He looked at her, his gaze cold and distant. "Fine, go play family with them. But don't expect me to be waiting when they're done with you." With that, he turned and walked away, leaving her standing alone in the alley, the silence ringing in her ears. The weight of his words settled heavily on her, a mix of anger, sadness, and doubt clouding her thoughts. She had hoped that he would understand, that he would be the one person who could support her unconditionally. But now, she felt as if she were losing him, too. Taking a shaky breath, she wiped her eyes and forced herself to walk away, her heart aching with the sense of a friendship slipping through her fingers. She didn't know if she had made the right choice, but she knew that if she turned back now, she might never know what else life had to offer. Later that evening, Sara found herself at Paul's apartment, the warmth of the place both comforting and strange. As she sat at the table, fidgeting with the edge of her sweater, Paul noticed the sadness in her eyes. "Sara, is everything all right?" he asked gently, his voice filled with concern. She looked down, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's just, I had a fight with someone, a friend. He doesn't understand why I'm here." Paul nodded, giving her the space to continue if she wanted. "I'm sorry to hear that. Sometimes people have a hard time when things change." Sara took a deep breath, struggling to put her feelings into words. He thinks I'm making a mistake, that I don't belong here with you and Mark. He thinks I'm going to lose myself." Paul reached across the table, his hand resting on hers. "Sara, I know how important your friends are to you, and I would never ask you to leave them behind. But I want you to know that you belong here, too. You're part of this family." She looked at him, a hint of vulnerability in her gaze. "I don't want to choose between him and this, but it feels like I have to." Paul's face softened, and he squeezed her hand gently. "You don't have to choose, Sara. You're allowed to have more than one place where you belong. People who love you will understand that." A tear slipped down her cheek, and she quickly wiped it away. He said I'd get hurt, that you'd turn your back on me eventually." Paul's heart ached at the pain in her voice. "Sara, I know I've made mistakes, and I know I have a lot to prove to you, but I promise I'm here for you. I won't turn my back on you." She looked down, her voice barely above a whisper. "I want to believe that, but I'm scared. I'm scared of being disappointed again." Paul nodded, his gaze filled with understanding. "I understand, Sara, and I know it's hard to trust, but trust doesn't happen overnight. It's something we build, step by step, and I'm willing to take every step with you, as long as it takes." Sara took a shaky breath, a small flicker of hope sparking within her. "I want to try. I want to see if maybe things can be different." Paul's face broke into a gentle smile. "That's all I could ever ask for, Sara. Just a chance to show you that you're not alone." As they sat together, a sense of calm washed over Sara. Despite the pain of her argument with Jordan, she felt a strange clarity, realization that she didn't have to choose between her past and the possibility of a new future. She could hold on to the parts of herself that mattered, while still allowing room for the people who were trying to love her. In that quiet moment, she allowed herself to breathe, to imagine a life where she didn't have to live in constant fear of being abandoned or betrayed. And for the first time, she began to believe that maybe, just maybe, she could build something meaningful with the people who wanted to be part of her life. As the days passed, Sara continued to visit Paul and Mark. She began to settle into a tentative routine, finding herself drawn to their warmth despite her lingering fears. The sense of family that was slowly taking shape filled her with a cautious hope, one she held close, afraid to fully embrace. One evening, Paul and Mark decided to take Sara to a small art exhibition in the city. They thought it might be a welcome distraction, something new to experience together. As they arrived, the soft lighting of the gallery bathed the room in a cozy glow, and quiet classical music drifted through the space, blending with the murmurs of other visitors. Sarah's eyes roamed the room, curiosity sparking as she took in the vibrant paintings and intricate sculptures. For a moment, she felt like she was stepping into a world completely different from the one she had known. "Do you like it?" Paul asked, his voice filled with hopeful excitement. Sara glanced at him, a small smile breaking through her usual guarded expression. "It's different. I've never seen anything like this up close." Mark chuckled, nudging her gently. "Stick with us. We'll show you all the weird art this city has to offer." She laughed, the sound light and genuine, surprising even herself. As they moved from piece to piece, Paul and Mark took turns pointing out their favorites, sharing stories of their own experiences with art. Sara listened, feeling a strange sense of belonging as she absorbed their words. She found herself relaxing, letting go of the usual tension that held her back. Then, as they stopped in front of a large, abstract painting, Sara felt a tug on her heart. The painting was a swirl of dark colors, like a storm contained within a frame. It reminded her of the chaos and loneliness she had felt for so long, a turmoil she couldn't escape. "It's beautiful," she whispered, her gaze fixed on the painting. Paul nodded beside her, sensing the connection she was forming. Art has a way of expressing things we can't always put into words. Sara glanced at him, her voice hesitant. It's like all the things I've felt but never said." Mark stepped closer, a gentle smile on his face. "Then maybe it's a good thing you're here. Art like this can make us feel understood, even when we don't have the words." They continued exploring the gallery, each conversation and shared glance chipping away at Sara's walls. For the first time, she felt herself opening up, allowing herself to feel that maybe, just maybe, she could belong with them. At the end of the evening, as they were leaving, Paul put his arm around her shoulders, a gesture so natural that it surprised them both. Sara felt a warmth spread through her, something she hadn't felt in years. "Sara, thank you for coming with us tonight," Paul said, his voice filled with gratitude. "It means a lot to me, to us." She looked up at him, her eyes soft. "Thank you for bringing me here. I never thought I'd see anything like this." As they walked back to the car, the chill of the night air brushed against them, adding a sense of quiet intimacy to the moment. Sara found herself leaning into Paul's embrace, a small gesture that felt both foreign and comforting. But as they reached the car, a voice called out from behind them, shattering the peaceful silence. "Sara, so this is where you've been hiding?" They turned to see Jordan standing under a streetlight, his face shadowed with a mixture of anger and disbelief. He stepped closer, his gaze fixed on Sara, ignoring Paul and Mark. "Jordan," Sara murmured, her heart sinking. She hadn't expected to see him. Not here, not like this. Jordan's eyes flickered with a hurt she hadn't anticipated. "I knew it. I knew you'd end up here, pretending to be part of their world, letting them buy you off with fancy dinners and art galleries." Sara felt a pang of shame, her throat tightening. "It's not like that, Jordan. They're trying to help." Jordan let out a harsh laugh, shaking his head. "Help? Sara, they're using you. They're making themselves feel good by saving you. Don't you see that?" Paul took a step forward, his voice calm but firm. "Jordan, you're welcome to talk to Sara, but please show some respect." Jordan's gaze snapped to Paul, his eyes narrowing. "Respect? You think you can just waltz in and fix everything? You don't know what she's been through. You don't know her like I do." Sara's heart pounded, torn between the familiar loyalty she felt toward Jordan and the new hope she was beginning to build with Paul and Mark. "Jordan, please," she said quietly, her voice wavering. They're different from what you think." "Different?" Jordan scoffed, his voice dripping with bitterness. "They're using you, Sara, and you're letting them. I thought you were stronger than this." The words stung, and she looked away, feeling the weight of his judgment. Mark stepped in, his tone gentle but protective. "Sara is allowed to make her own choices, Jordan. Just because you don't agree doesn't mean you can tear her down." Jordan clenched his fists, his expression one of betrayal. Fine, go ahead, Sara. Be their project. But don't expect me to be here when they're done with you. Before she could respond, he turned and walked away, his footsteps fading into the night. The silence that followed felt heavy, almost suffocating, as Sara stood there, frozen with a mix of sadness and anger. Paul placed a hand on her shoulder, his voice soft. Sara, you don't have to listen to him. He doesn't understand what you're going through. She looked up at him, her eyes filled with pain. Maybe he's right. Maybe I'm just letting myself get carried away. I don't want to be someone's project. Paul's face softened, his voice gentle. Sara, you're not a project. You're my daughter. And I'm here because I care about you, not because I want to change you. Mark nodded, his gaze steady. You're part of our lives now, Sara. We're not here to fix you. We're here to share life with you as equals. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. It's hard to believe that sometimes people have left before, and I don't know if I can trust that this will be any different. Paul's hand tightened on her shoulder, his expression filled with quiet determination. I can't change the past, Sara, but I can promise you that I'm not going anywhere. Neither of us are. Mark gave her a reassuring smile. And if you ever feel like we're doing anything that makes you uncomfortable, tell us. We'll always listen. Sara looked between them, her heart a tangled mess of emotions. But as she stood there, something shifted. A small glimmer of faith that maybe, just maybe, they were telling the truth. Thank you, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. For not giving up on me. Paul's face softened, his eyes filled with pride. There's nothing that could make us give up on you, Sara. They stood in the quiet of the night, the streetlights casting a warm glow over them. And for the first time, Sara allowed herself to believe that she didn't have to be alone, that she could have people who cared, even if the journey to fully trusting them was far from over. As they made their way to the car, Sara felt a tentative sense of peace, a hope that maybe her life was beginning to change for the better. But even as she settled into this new reality, a part of her remained vigilant, knowing that trust was a fragile thing, and life had a way of testing even the strongest bonds. In the weeks following their night at the gallery, Sara's relationship with Paul and Mark deepened. She found herself visiting Paul's apartment more frequently, helping him with small tasks, sharing meals, and even laughing at Mark's attempts at cooking, which usually ended in burned pots and smoky kitchens. Little by little, the invisible wall she had built around herself began to lower, brick by brick. One afternoon, as Sara sat on the couch flipping through an old family album Paul had dug out of his closet, she stumbled across a picture of a much younger Paul, holding a baby girl with a wide, joyful grin. Her heart skipped a beat as she traced her finger over the faded photograph, recognizing her own face staring back. "Is that me?" she asked softly, her voice barely a whisper. Paul, who was setting a plate of cookies on the coffee table, looked up, his face breaking into a warm smile as he saw the photo she was holding. "Yes, that's you. You were just a few months old there. Happiest baby I'd ever seen." Sara looked down at the photo again, a strange feeling of warmth and sadness filling her chest. "I don't remember any of this." Paul sat beside her, his gaze fixed on the album. "I wish you did. Those were some of the best days of my life." Sara felt a pang of sadness, a longing for the life she had missed out on. She glanced up at Paul, her voice hesitant. "What was I like back then?" Paul's eyes softened, and he reached out, gently placing a hand on her shoulder. "You were curious about everything. Every little sound, every movement. You'd watch it all with those big, bright eyes. You'd reach for everything, like you were trying to grab hold of the whole world." A small smile tugged at her lips, but it quickly faded as doubt crept in. "Do you ever wish things had been different? That you hadn't lost me?" Paul's face grew solemn, his voice low and filled with regret. "Every day, Sara. There's not a day that goes by that I don't think about all the moments I missed. But I'm here now, and I want to make up for every lost day, if you'll let me." She looked away, her emotions swirling as she struggled to hold back tears. "It's hard, you know? Knowing I could have had this family, this life, and it was all taken away. Paul nodded, his gaze filled with understanding. I know, Sara, and I don't expect you to just forget all the years we lost. But I'm here now, and I promise, I'll be here for as long as you want me to be. Sara took a shaky breath, looking down at her hands. It's hard to let myself feel close to you. Every time I start to care, I get scared that something's going to go wrong. That you'll leave. Paul's hand tightened gently on her shoulder. I can't change the past, Sara. I can't undo what happened. But I can promise you this, I'm not going anywhere. No matter what. She turned to face him, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. I want to believe that, but I don't know if I can. Paul took her hand in his voice filled with quiet conviction. Then let's take it one day at a time. You don't have to believe me all at once. Just let me prove it to you, little by little. For a long moment, they sat in silence, the weight of his words settling over them. The tension that had once filled the room was replaced by a quiet, tentative peace. Just then, Mark walked in, holding a small box with a sheepish grin. Am I interrupting something serious? Sara let out a soft laugh, wiping her eyes. No, you're fine. What's in the box? Mark's grin widened, and he sat down beside them, opening the box to reveal a small, handcrafted bracelet. It was a simple design, with colorful beads strung along a thin leather cord. I made this for you, he said, his tone light but earnest. I figured it might be a small reminder that you're part of our family now. Sara's eyes widened, and she reached out to touch the bracelet, her fingers tracing over the smooth beads. You made this? Mark shrugged, trying to act casual, but there was a hint of pride in his smile. Yeah, well, I had some time on my hands, and I figured, since you're stuck with us, you might as well have something to remember us by. She looked up at him, a genuine smile breaking through her usually guarded expression. Thank you, Mark. It's beautiful. Mark's cheeks flushed slightly, and he chuckled. Just don't wear it when you're around your cooler friends. They might laugh at my amateur craftsmanship. Sara laughed, slipping the bracelet onto her wrist. I love it. I'll wear it all the time. Paul watched the exchange, his heart swelling with a mixture of pride and gratitude. Seeing Sara smile, seeing her accept even the smallest gesture of belonging, filled him with a renewed sense of hope. As the evening wore on, they continued flipping through the photo album, sharing stories, laughing, and reminiscing over moments that were both real and imagined. Moments they wished they had experienced together. For the first time in a long time, Sara allowed herself to feel like she was part of something bigger, something meaningful. Just as they were finishing the album, Sara's phone buzzed on the table. She glanced at the screen, her face paling slightly as she saw a message from Jordan. You're really just going to forget everything we went through? The message read. Don't let them change you, Sara. Don't let them make you weak. Her heart sank, the familiar guilt and confusion washing over her. She had tried to reach out to Jordan, to explain that her new life didn't mean she was abandoning their past. But he hadn't responded until now, and his words felt like a punch to the gut. Noticing her reaction, Paul placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. Sara, are you all right? She looked up, forcing a small smile. Yeah, it's just an old friend. Mark's gaze softened, his voice quiet. Jordan? She nodded, her fingers trembling slightly as she locked her phone. He doesn't understand why I'm here. He thinks I'm turning my back on him. Paul's expression grew somber. I know it's hard, Sara, but you don't have to choose between your past and your future. You're allowed to carry both with you. Mark leaned in, his tone gentle but firm. And if he's really your friend, he'll understand. Sometimes people just need time to adjust. Sara took a deep breath, nodding as she tried to steady herself. I hope so. I don't want to lose him. He was there for me when no one else was. Paul's voice was filled with understanding. I respect that, Sara, and I would never ask you to leave him behind. You're allowed to have different people in your life who mean different things to you. She looked down at the bracelet on her wrist, a small smile tugging at the corners of her lips. Thank you, both of you, for not making me choose. Mark reached over, squeezing her hand gently. You're family now, Sara. That means you're stuck with us, whether you like it or not." She laughed, the sound light and genuine. And for the first time, the weight of her past felt a little lighter, as if maybe, just maybe, she could move forward without leaving behind the parts of herself that mattered. As the evening drew to a close, Sara felt a sense of peace settle over her. The doubts and fears were still there, but they felt manageable, softened by the warmth of the people who had opened their hearts to her. And as she said her goodbyes, she knew that this was just the beginning, a journey toward healing, toward trust, and maybe even toward love. A few days after the evening spent with Paul and Mark, Sara found herself haunted by an undercurrent of doubt and sadness she couldn't quite shake. No matter how much she tried to focus on the moments of joy and connection she'd felt, her past struggles kept resurfacing, casting shadows over her newfound hope. One evening, while she was visiting Paul's apartment, the weight of her emotions became unbearable. She had tried to hold it all in, to stay calm and composed, but as she sat across from Paul, watching him carefully prepare dinner, her heart felt too heavy to bear. Paul noticed her quiet demeanor, setting down his knife as he studied her face. "Sara, you look troubled. Is everything all right?" She hesitated, her fingers nervously tracing patterns on the table. I don't know, Paul. It's just, everything feels so overwhelming." He nodded, his gaze filled with concern. "I know this is a lot. Take your time. Whatever you need to say, I'm here to listen." Sara's hands trembled as she tried to find the words. "I've been trying to accept all of this, to trust you. But it's hard, Paul. I don't know if I can." Paul pulled out a chair and sat beside her, his voice gentle. "Sara, trust isn't something that happens overnight. It takes time, and I know I haven't earned all of it yet, but I want to." She looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of pain and vulnerability. "You say that, but I keep thinking about how you weren't there when I needed you most. You don't know what it was like, Paul, to feel like I was abandoned." Paul's face fell, guilt and sorrow deepening the lines around his eyes. "Sara, I can't tell you how much I regret not being there. I wanted to find you. I searched, but I failed. And for that, I am so sorry." Tears pricked at her eyes, and she looked away, her voice breaking. "Do you know how many nights I lay awake, wondering why no one was there? Wondering if I wasn't worth looking for?" Paul reached out, his hand covering hers. "You were worth everything, Sara. I don't have any excuse for why I didn't find you sooner. All I can say is that I tried, and I failed. But that doesn't mean I didn't want you. I've wanted you in my life every single day." She pulled her hand back, her face etched with a mixture of anger and sadness. "Wanting isn't the same as being there. You have no idea what it felt like, Paul, to feel like no one cared." Paul's voice shook, his own eyes filled with unshed tears. "You're right, Sara. I don't know what it felt like. I wasn't there to protect you, to give you the love and safety you deserved. And I will never forgive myself for that." She took a deep breath, her shoulders sagging as years of pain and resentment poured out. "Sometimes, I feel like I'll never be able to let go of the hurt. Like it's too much to ever feel whole again." Paul moved closer, his hand hovering over hers, as if asking for permission. When she didn't pull away, he gently held her hand in his touch warm and steady. "Sara, I know I can't undo the past, but I can be here for you now. I can be here as long as you need me, for every step forward, every tear, every moment of doubt." She looked at him, her eyes brimming with emotion. "I want to believe that. I really do. But sometimes it feels like it's too late." Paul's face softened, his gaze unwavering. "It's never too late, Sara. I'm here for you, now and forever. And if there's anything I can do to help you heal, to help you trust again, just tell me. I'll do anything." She took a shaky breath, her voice barely above a whisper. I need to know that you won't leave, that you won't walk away when things get hard." Paul's voice was firm, filled with quiet conviction. "I'm not going anywhere, Sara. Not now, not ever. I've spent too long without you. I won't lose you again." A tear slipped down her cheek, and she quickly wiped it away, her voice trembling. "I'm scared, Paul, I'm scared of trusting you, of trusting anyone. I don't want to be let down again. He gave her hand a gentle squeeze, his eyes filled with empathy. I know, Sara, and I don't expect you to trust me right away. All I ask is that you give me a chance to show you, day by day, that I'm here, that I love you. They sat together in silence, the quiet weight of their conversation settling over them. For the first time, Sara felt as if the walls she had built around her heart were cracking, allowing a sliver of light to shine through. After a few moments, Mark walked in, sensing the tension but not wanting to intrude. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. Sara looked up, offering him a faint smile. It's okay, Mark. We were just talking. Mark nodded, his face softening as he took in her tear-streaked cheeks. Are you all right? She took a deep breath, glancing between Mark and Paul. I think so. Or at least, I think I will be. Mark stepped closer, his tone gentle. We're here, Sara. Whatever you need, we're here. She nodded, a small, tentative smile breaking through her sadness. Thank you. Both of you. Paul smiled, his eyes filled with relief. We're in this together, Sara. Every step of the way. Mark placed a comforting hand on her shoulder, his voice soft. And just so you know, it's okay to be scared. We're all scared sometimes. But we don't have to face it alone. A tear slipped down her cheek, but this time, she didn't wipe it away. Instead, she looked at both of them, allowing herself to feel the warmth and love they offered. For the first time, she felt as if maybe, just maybe, she didn't have to carry the weight of her pain alone. As the evening drew to a close, they sat together, talking, laughing, and sharing stories. And with each passing moment, Sara felt herself opening up a little more, letting go of a bit of the hurt she had carried for so long. When she finally said goodbye, Paul walked her to the door, his voice filled with quiet hope. Take care, Sara. And remember, I'm just a call away. She looked at him, a hint of vulnerability in her gaze. I know. Thank you, Paul, for everything. As she walked down the hall, a sense of peace settled over her, a feeling that maybe, just maybe, she could heal. It would be a long journey, but she was no longer alone. The next day, Sara walked with a renewed sense of hope, feeling a little lighter. The conversation with Paul had been intense, but it had brought a small measure of peace, a belief that maybe she could trust again. However, that fragile hope was soon to be tested in ways she hadn't anticipated. Later that afternoon, Sara received a message from Jordan. She hadn't heard from him since their argument, and seeing his name on her screen made her heart race. She hesitated for a moment before opening the message. Meet me at our spot, the message read. We need to talk. Curiosity and anxiety swirled within her as she made her way to the small, secluded park where they had often met. As she approached, she saw Jordan leaning against a tree, his expression tense and guarded. Hey, she greeted him cautiously, unsure of his mood. Jordan looked up, his gaze cold. So, you're still playing family with them? She felt her defenses rising, but tried to stay calm. Jordan, it's not about playing family. I'm just trying to find my place. He scoffed, shaking his head. Your place? Your place is with the people who know you, who understand you, not with those rich guys pretending to care. Sara's voice was steady, though her hands trembled slightly. They're not pretending, Jordan. They've been there for me. They've shown me things can be different. Jordan's jaw clenched, his voice sharp. Different? Sara, they're not like us. They don't know what it's like to survive out here. You're fooling yourself if you think they'll stick around when things get tough. Sara took a deep breath, struggling to hold back her frustration. Maybe you're right. Maybe they don't understand everything. But they're trying, Jordan. And I'm trying too. I can't keep living in fear. Jordan's gaze softened slightly, a flicker of pain crossing his face. You think I don't want better for you? I do, Sara. But I also know how these people work. They'll get tired of you, or you'll do something they don't like. And then what? You'll be right back here alone. Sara felt a pang of sadness, but she held her ground. If that happens, then I'll deal with it. But I can't keep pushing everyone away just because I'm scared of getting hurt. Jordan looked away, his face hardening. Fine, do what you want. But don't expect me to be here when you come crawling back. The words struck her like a blow, but she forced herself to stay composed. If that's how you feel, then maybe this is goodbye. Jordan didn't respond, his silence a bitter confirmation. Without another word, Sara turned and walked away, each step feeling heavier than the last. Her heart ached, torn between loyalty to her past and the possibility of a new future. But she knew that she couldn't keep clinging to people who wouldn't let her grow. That night, as she sat in Paul's apartment, the weight of the day settled over her, bringing an overwhelming sense of sadness and doubt. Paul noticed her quietness, his eyes filled with concern. "Sara, are you okay?" he asked gently. She hesitated, struggling to find the words. "I saw Jordan today. We had a fight. I think he's done with me." Paul reached out, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. "I'm sorry, Sara. I know how much he means to you." She looked down, her voice barely above a whisper. I feel like I'm losing everything that made me who I am. Like I'm betraying my past just by being here." Paul's face softened, and he moved closer, his voice filled with empathy. "Sara, you're not betraying anyone. You're allowed to grow, to find new parts of yourself. That doesn't mean you're forgetting where you came from." She took a deep breath, her emotions swirling. "But what if I don't belong anywhere? What if I'm just fooling myself?" Paul's hand tightened on her shoulder, his gaze steady. "You belong with us, Sara. I can't promise that it'll be easy, or that it'll always make sense. But you're not alone." Just then, the sound of a loud knock echoed through the apartment, startling them both. Paul stood up, exchanging a worried glance with Sara before walking to the door. He opened it to find two police officers standing there, their expressions serious. Sara felt her heart plummet, a cold dread settling in her stomach. "Is there a problem, officers?" Paul asked, his voice calm but tense. One of the officers looked at Sara, then back at Paul. "We're here to speak with Sara. There's been a report of theft linked to her." Sara's eyes widened, shock and confusion flooding her mind. "What? I didn't steal anything." The second officer stepped forward, his voice firm. "We received a report that you've been taking money and items from a local store without paying." Sara's hands shook, her voice rising in panic. "I don't know what you're talking about. I haven't done anything like that." Paul put a protective arm around her, his voice calm but filled with urgency. "Officers, I think there's been a misunderstanding. Sara hasn't stolen anything. She's been with me." The first officer held up a hand, his tone unmoved. "We'll need to take her in for questioning. It's standard procedure." Sara felt a wave of fear crash over her, the familiar feeling of being trapped, of having no control. She looked up at Paul, her eyes pleading. "Paul, please. I didn't do anything. You have to believe me." Paul's face was filled with anguish, but he nodded firmly. "I believe you, Sara, and I'm not going to let you face this alone." He turned to the officers, his voice steady. "Can we come down with her? She's not alone in this." The officers exchanged a glance, then nodded reluctantly. "All right, but we'll need to ask her some questions at the station." As they led Sara out, Paul and Mark followed closely, their presence a small comfort amidst her fear. At the police station, they sat with her as the officers questioned her, each accusation feeling like a blow to her already fragile sense of security. Through the interrogation, Paul stayed by her side, holding her hand, his unwavering support giving her strength. When the officers finally realized there had been a mistake, a misunderstanding with someone who resembled her, Sara felt both relief and a lingering sense of injustice. As they left the station, Paul turned to her, his voice filled with quiet determination. "Sara, I'm so sorry you had to go through that, but I'm here. We're here, no matter what." She nodded, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you, Paul. I don't know what I would have done without you." They walked back to the car in silence, the night air heavy with the weight of everything that had happened. Sara felt drained, her mind racing with a mixture of fear, relief, and a newfound trust in Paul and Mark. As they drove home, Paul reached over, gently squeezing her hand. You're safe now, Sara, and I'll make sure it stays that way." For the first time, she allowed herself to fully lean on him, the walls around her heart crumbling a little more. She didn't know what the future held, but for tonight, she knew she wasn't alone. In the days following the police station incident, Sara found herself in a state of emotional exhaustion. The fear and humiliation of being accused, coupled with her fight with Jordan, had left her feeling raw and uncertain. Paul and Mark, sensing her turmoil, offered quiet support, giving her the space she needed while reminding her that they were always there if she needed to talk. One evening, as she sat on the couch in Paul's apartment, her gaze drifted toward the window, watching the lights of the city twinkle against the dark sky. The silence was comforting, allowing her thoughts to settle. She hadn't spoken to Jordan since their fight, and the distance between them felt like a void she couldn't fill. Yet, she also felt a deep gratitude for Paul and Mark, who had shown unwavering support during one of her most vulnerable moments. Just as she was lost in thought, Paul walked into the room, carrying 2 mugs of tea. He set one in front of her, then sat down across from her, his gaze gentle. "Sara," he began softly, "you've been really quiet these past few days. Is there anything on your mind?" She took a sip of tea, feeling the warmth seep through her, grounding her. "I don't know, Paul. It's just a lot. Everything with Jordan, with the police. It feels like my whole life is spinning out of control." Paul nodded, his eyes filled with empathy. "I can't imagine what it must feel like, but I want you to know that you're not alone in this. Whatever you're feeling, we're here." Sara hesitated, then looked up, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's just, sometimes I feel like I'm caught between 2 worlds. Part of me wants to move forward, to leave behind all the pain and struggle. But another part of me, it feels like I'm betraying my past, betraying Jordan." Paul's expression softened, and he leaned forward, his voice steady. "Sara, your past is a part of you. It's shaped who you are. But that doesn't mean you have to stay there forever. You can honor your past and still move forward." She sighed, her gaze dropping to her hands. "But what if I lose myself in the process? What if I forget everything that made me who I am?" Paul reached out, gently taking her hand in his. "You won't lose yourself, Sara. You're stronger than that. And you're allowed to grow, to become someone who feels safe and loved. That doesn't erase who you were. It just adds to who you are." She looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of hope and fear. "I want to believe that. I really do. But it's hard to let go of all the years I spent surviving. Sometimes it feels like survival is all I know." Paul gave her hand a reassuring squeeze. "I understand, Sara, and I know that it's not easy to just let go. But you don't have to do it alone. You have people here who care about you, who want to help you carry that weight." Sara took a shaky breath, allowing his words to sink in. "I'm just so scared, Paul. Scared that if I let myself be happy, something will go wrong, and I'll end up hurt all over again." Paul's face filled with empathy, and he moved closer, his voice soft. "I won't lie to you, Sara. Life is unpredictable, but living in constant fear of the what-ifs, that's no way to live. You deserve more than just survival. You deserve a life where you can dream, where you can be happy." She looked away, her voice trembling. "I don't know if I know how to be happy." Mark, who had been listening quietly from the doorway, stepped into the room, his gaze gentle but determined. "Sara, happiness isn't something that comes all at once. It's something you build, little by little. And it's okay if it feels strange or even scary at first." Sara looked between Paul and Mark, a flicker of hope sparking within her. "You both make it sound so simple." Mark chuckled softly, sitting down beside her. "It's not simple. It's probably one of the hardest things you'll ever do. But it's worth it, Sara. You're worth it." For a moment, they sat in silence, the weight of their words settling over them. Sara felt a warmth in her chest, a glimmer of belief that maybe, just maybe, she could have the life she had always dreamed of. After a few minutes, she looked up, her gaze steady. I think I want to try. I don't know if I'll ever feel completely ready, but I don't want to keep running away." Paul smiled, a mixture of pride and relief in his eyes. "That's all we could ever ask, Sara. Just take it one step at a time." And remember, we'll be here every step of the way." Mark nodded, his voice filled with quiet strength. "You're not alone, Sara. Not anymore." She let out a shaky breath, a small smile breaking through her usual guarded expression. "Thank you for everything." Paul reached out, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. "Thank you for trusting us, even when it's hard. That means everything to us." They sat together, the quiet moment filled with a newfound sense of peace and unity. For the first time, Sara allowed herself to feel the weight of her past lifting, replaced by the possibility of a future filled with hope and connection. That night, as she lay in bed, her mind drifted back to Jordan and the life they had shared. She felt a pang of sadness, a sense of loss for the friendship that had once been her anchor. But she also knew that she couldn't stay trapped in the past, bound by fear and survival. In the stillness of the night, Sara made a silent promise to herself. She would honor her past, but she would no longer let it define her. She would embrace the new family she had found, allowing herself to dream of a life beyond survival. And with that promise, she drifted into a peaceful sleep, ready to face whatever the future held, one step at a time. In the days following her resolution to move forward, Sara felt a newfound clarity. For the first time, she allowed herself to dream of a future beyond her past. Her relationship with Paul and Mark grew stronger, and she started to see them not only as mentors but as a family, something she had never imagined for herself. One afternoon, as they were sitting around the kitchen table, Paul looked up from his cup of coffee, his expression thoughtful. "Sara," he began, "I've been thinking. I want to formally make you part of my life. I want to do more than just say it." She blinked, surprised. "What do you mean?" He leaned forward, his eyes warm and steady. "I want you to have the same rights and protections as any family member. I've been speaking with a lawyer about legal guardianship. I know you're not a child, but I want to make this official. You'll always have a place here, no matter what." Sara's breath caught in her throat. She looked down, the emotions overwhelming her. "Paul, you're serious?" Paul's hand reached across the table, covering hers. "Yes, Sara, I'm serious. You're family to me, to both of us." He glanced at Mark, who nodded, a soft smile on his face. Mark added, his voice gentle, "We want you to feel secure, to know that this is your home. No conditions, no strings." Sara felt tears prickling at the corners of her eyes, her voice choked with emotion. "I don't know what to say. I've never had anything like this before." Paul squeezed her hand gently. "You don't have to say anything now. Just think about it. We're here, no matter what you decide." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of Paul's offer settling over them. Sara felt a sense of peace mixed with disbelief. Part of her still feared this was all too good to be true, that something would inevitably shatter this happiness. But another part of her, a part that was growing stronger each day, wanted to believe in the possibility of a safe, loving home. That evening, as she wandered the neighborhood alone, she felt her phone buzz in her pocket. She pulled it out and saw Jordan's name on the screen. Her heart skipped a beat, and she hesitated before answering. "Hey, Jordan," she said softly, her voice cautious. His tone was flat, a hint of bitterness beneath the surface. "So, you've moved in with them now? Gone full family mode?" Sara sighed, her voice barely above a whisper. "Jordan, I'm trying to find a place where I can feel safe, where I can have a real future." There was a long pause, and when Jordan finally spoke, his words were laced with hurt. "And that's not with me? After everything we've been through?" She swallowed, feeling a familiar ache. "I didn't say that. You'll always be important to me, Jordan. But I need to do this for myself. I can't keep living the way I was." His voice grew colder. "So you're just going to leave me behind? Abandon me, like everyone else?" The accusation stung, but she forced herself to stay calm. "I'm not abandoning you, Jordan. I want you in my life. But I can't keep holding myself back just because you don't believe things can be different." His laughter was bitter, hollow. "You really think they're going to accept you? That you can just erase the past?" Sara's grip tightened on her phone. "I don't want to erase anything, but I deserve a chance at happiness, at a life where I don't have to keep looking over my shoulder." Jordan's voice dropped to a whisper, filled with disappointment. I thought you were different, Sara. I thought you'd never be one of them. She felt a pang of sadness, knowing this conversation might be their last. Jordan, please don't make this about choosing sides. I'm just trying to find myself. Another silence stretched between them, heavy and final. Goodbye, Sara, he said, his tone cold and detached. The line went dead, and Sara stood alone on the sidewalk, the darkness pressing around her. She stared at her phone, her heart breaking at the realization that she had lost one of the most important people in her life. But even through the pain, she felt a strange sense of relief, a freedom she had never allowed herself before. As she walked back to Paul's apartment, the weight of Jordan's absence settled in, but she also felt a new determination. She was ready to step fully into this new chapter, even if it meant leaving parts of her old life behind. When she returned, Paul was sitting on the couch, his face lighting up as she walked in. Hey, you're back. How was your walk? She managed a small smile, though her eyes were still red. It was emotional. He looked at her, his gaze gentle and knowing. You spoke with Jordan, didn't you? She nodded, her voice cracking. He doesn't understand, and I don't think he ever will. Paul rose, wrapping her in a comforting hug. I'm so sorry, Sara. I know how much he meant to you. She clung to him, feeling the comfort and safety of his embrace. It hurts, Paul, but I think it's what I needed to finally move on. He held her for a moment longer, then pulled back, his hands resting on her shoulders. You're one of the strongest people I know, Sara, and no matter what, you have a place here. You're not alone. She smiled, a genuine warmth spreading through her. Thank you, Paul. I don't think I'd be here if it weren't for you and Mark. Mark appeared in the doorway, smiling softly. Hey, what's all this serious talk? We've got ice cream in the freezer, and it's not going to eat itself. Sara laughed, a sound that felt foreign yet wonderful. That sounds perfect. They spent the rest of the evening in comfortable companionship, sharing stories, laughing, and, for a moment, forgetting the weight of the world. As she sat with them, Sara felt a new sense of belonging, a feeling that she was exactly where she was meant to be. A week passed since Sara's conversation with Jordan, and though the ache of their goodbye lingered, she felt a sense of clarity she had never known before. For the first time, she felt free to live for herself, unshackled from the constraints of her past. One afternoon, Paul suggested that they visit his lawyer to finalize the paperwork for her legal guardianship. Though Sara was nervous, she agreed, realizing that this step symbolized her commitment to a new life, a chance to claim her own future. They entered the lawyer's office, a sleek space lined with bookshelves and a polished wooden desk at the center. As they waited, Paul reached over, giving her hand a reassuring squeeze. You okay? He asked, his voice filled with concern. Sara nodded, taking a deep breath. Yeah, just trying to let it all sink in. It feels surreal. Paul's eyes softened, his gaze steady. You deserve this, Sara. A safe home, a family, everything. The lawyer, Mr. Hernandez, finally entered, greeting them warmly and motioning for them to sit. As he pulled out the necessary paperwork, he explained each detail patiently, making sure Sara understood her rights and the security this would bring her. Sara, he began, glancing up at her with a kind smile. This is more than just a formality. This gives you legal protection, the same as any family member would have. You're entitled to a future free from the burdens of the past. She looked down at the papers, her hand hovering over the pen. Thank you, Mr. Hernandez. This means a lot. As she signed her name, she felt a wave of emotions, relief, joy, and a lingering sadness that she hadn't expected. This step marked a new chapter, but it also forced her to confront the reality of leaving her old life behind. When they left the office, she and Paul decided to take a detour through the nearby park. The sun was setting, casting a warm golden glow over the trees, and the air was filled with the soft hum of city sounds. Thank you for doing this with me, Paul, Sara said, her voice filled with quiet gratitude. I don't think I could have done it alone. Paul wrapped an arm around her shoulders, his voice gentle. You'll never have to, Sara. Not as long as I'm around." They walked in silence for a few minutes, the calm of the evening settling around them. Just as they were nearing the edge of the park, they spotted someone standing by the entrance, leaning casually against a lamppost. As they drew closer, Sarah's heart sank. It was Jordan. She hadn't expected to see him again, and the sight of him brought a rush of memories, both good and painful. She stopped in her tracks, her mind racing as she tried to process his sudden appearance. "Jordan," she said, her voice steady but guarded. He looked up, his gaze sharp and slightly resentful. "So, it's true then? You're really going through with this? Letting him take you in, like you're some charity case?" Sara felt Paul tense beside her, but she held up a hand, signaling for him to stay calm. She took a step closer to Jordan, her voice firm. "This isn't charity, Jordan. It's my life. My chance to have something I've never had." He scoffed, crossing his arms. "And you think that makes it real? You think this is going to last?" Sara felt her patience wearing thin. "Yes, I do. Because they've shown me more love and support than I've ever known. And I'm not going to let your bitterness ruin that." Jordan's eyes narrowed, hurt flashing across his face before he quickly masked it. "I'm not bitter, Sara. I'm just realistic. People like us don't get fairy tales. We get what we can and we survive." She took a deep breath, steadying herself. "Maybe that's true for some people, but I'm done just surviving, Jordan. I want to live. I want a life where I don't have to keep looking over my shoulder, waiting for something to go wrong." Jordan shook his head, frustration etched across his face. "And you think they're going to save you? That you'll fit into their world, just like that?" Paul stepped forward, his voice calm but unwavering. "Sarah's not trying to fit into anyone's world, Jordan. She's creating her own. And if you really cared about her, you'd support her instead of trying to drag her back." Jordan turned to Paul, his expression filled with disdain. "You don't know anything about us, about what we've been through." Paul's gaze was steady, his tone filled with quiet strength. "You're right, I don't. But I do know that people who truly care about each other want the best for them. They don't hold each other back out of fear." Sara looked at Jordan, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and resolve. "Jordan, I want you to be part of my life. But I can't stay trapped in the past just to make you feel better. I need this. I need to believe that there's more out there for me." He stared at her, his expression unreadable, a long silence stretching between them. Finally, he looked away, his shoulders slumping. "I thought you were different, Sara," he muttered, his voice barely audible. "I thought we were in this together." Sara's voice softened, a hint of regret in her tone. "We were, Jordan. And I'll always be grateful for everything we went through. But I can't keep living in the shadows. Not anymore." Jordan looked up, a mixture of hurt and anger flashing in his eyes. "Then I guess this is goodbye." She nodded, feeling the weight of his words settle over her. "I guess it is." He hesitated, as if he wanted to say more. But then he turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing in the stillness of the park. She watched him go, a bittersweet ache in her chest, but also a sense of release, a realization that she had finally let go of the chains that had held her back for so long. Paul placed a comforting hand on her shoulder, his voice soft. "Are you all right?" She took a deep breath, nodding slowly. "I think so. It hurts, but I know this is what I needed to do." They stood together in the fading light, the weight of the moment settling over them. For the first time, Sara felt fully present in her life, unburdened by the expectations or fears of others. She was ready to step into her future on her own terms. As they walked back to the apartment, Paul's hand never left her shoulder, a silent reminder that she wasn't alone. And though the journey had been long and painful, Sara knew that she was finally moving toward a life filled with hope, healing, and love. In the following days, Sara found herself adjusting to her new life with an unexpected sense of peace. The confrontation with Jordan had left her feeling lighter, free from the weight of the past that had held her down. She focused on building a future with Paul and Mark, leaning into their support and beginning to trust that she had finally found a place where she belonged. One evening, as they were sitting together in the living room, laughing at a comedy show, there was a sudden knock at the door. Paul and Sara exchanged a glance, a flicker of unease passing between them. Mark rose from his seat, moving to open the door. Standing there was a man dressed in a crisp suit, his expression serious and composed. He looked like he had something important to say, his gaze sweeping over the three of them as he stepped inside. "Mr. Paul, Miss Sara," he began, his voice calm yet authoritative. "My name is Detective Keller. I'm here on behalf of the police department to discuss an incident reported recently." Paul's face grew tense, his protective instincts on high alert. "Detective Keller, is there something wrong?" Detective Keller nodded, glancing at Sara. "We received a complaint regarding a series of thefts in the neighborhood, and Miss Sara's name came up again. We'd like to clear this up as soon as possible." Sara's face paled, a flash of fear seizing her heart. "I don't know anything about those thefts," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I was accused before, but it was a mistake." Detective Keller nodded. "We're aware of that incident, but this time, there's been a new witness who claims to have seen you near one of the incidents. We take these allegations seriously, and we're hoping to get this sorted out as quickly as possible." Paul's hand found hers, his touch steady and reassuring. "Detective, I can vouch for Sara. She's been with us. She wouldn't have done anything like this." Detective Keller's gaze softened slightly, sensing the tension in the room. "I appreciate that, Mr. Paul, but we're obligated to follow up on every lead. And I thought it might be easier to handle this here, instead of at the station." Mark stepped forward, his expression calm but firm. "Detective, if this is just another misunderstanding, why drag Sara through this? There has to be another way to prove her innocence." Detective Keller hesitated, as if weighing his options. "There's no reason to make this more difficult than it has to be. I'm only here because I believe in getting to the truth. If Miss Sara can provide any kind of alibi, or if there's someone who can back up her whereabouts, this will go a long way in clearing things up." Sara felt a swell of frustration and fear rise within her. She looked at Paul and Mark, both of whom were watching her with concern, ready to defend her at any moment. Taking a deep breath, she found her voice. "Detective Keller, I don't know why someone would say these things about me. I've been trying to leave my old life behind, to move forward with people who care about me. I'd never risk everything for something like this." Detective Keller nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I can see that you're in a stable environment now, Miss Sara, but sometimes, people from our past try to pull us back into places we don't belong." A flicker of realization crossed her face, and she looked down, her thoughts racing. Do you think someone would do this just to get me in trouble?" Paul squeezed her hand gently. "Sara, do you think this has anything to do with Jordan?" She hesitated, the thought painful but plausible. "I don't know, but he didn't exactly support my decision to move forward. He thought I was abandoning everything we went through." Detective Keller observed their exchange, his eyes narrowing thoughtfully. "Do you believe Jordan would go to these lengths?" Sara felt a pang of regret and sadness. "I want to believe he wouldn't, but he was so angry. Maybe he thought this would scare me back into that life." The detective's face softened. It's not uncommon for people in difficult situations to react poorly when someone close to them chooses a different path. But these are serious allegations, and I need to confirm the details before proceeding further. Mark stepped forward, determination clear in his voice. "Detective, Sara's been with us every day. We can provide details and times, anything you need to verify her location. She deserves to be free of this shadow hanging over her." Detective Keller nodded, jotting down some notes. "I'll need some specifics, but if we can confirm your account, this could close the case." As they went over the details, Paul and Mark recounted moments with Sara, outlining her whereabouts during each incident. Detective Keller listened attentively, his expression thoughtful as he pieced together their timeline. After they finished, he closed his notebook, nodding with satisfaction. "Thank you, both of you. This should be enough to support Miss Sara's alibi. We'll follow up on the witness report and check the original statement." Sara let out a sigh of relief, her shoulders relaxing as the weight began to lift. "Thank you, Detective Keller. I just want to put all of this behind me." The detective gave her a reassuring smile. "I understand, Miss Sara, and if this turns out to be what we think it is, a misunderstanding fueled by someone's anger. Rest assured, we'll handle it. You deserve a fresh start without these burdens. As Detective Keller left, Paul turned to Sara, pulling her into a comforting embrace. I'm so proud of you, Sara. You handled that with so much strength. Mark joined them, his voice filled with pride. You stood your ground, Sara. No matter what happens, you have us in your corner. Sara felt a warmth spread through her, a feeling of safety and belonging that had once seemed impossible. Thank you, both of you. I couldn't have done this without you. They spent the rest of the evening talking, their laughter filling the room, a stark contrast to the tension that had hung over them earlier. And as they sat together, Sara felt a deep sense of justice, a belief that she had finally escaped the shadows of her past. After Detective Keller's visit, the tension in the apartment seemed to dissipate, replaced by a newfound sense of security and resilience. Sara felt lighter, as if she had finally broken free from the lingering shadows of her past. The incident had tested her trust in Paul and Mark, and they had shown her, time and again, that they were her family, standing by her even through the toughest moments. One evening, Paul suggested they go out to celebrate the end of the ordeal. They chose a cozy little restaurant with soft lighting, where the quiet chatter of other diners and the smell of freshly baked bread made the atmosphere warm and welcoming. As they sat down, Paul looked at Sara, a proud smile on his face. You've come so far, Sara, he said, his tone soft but filled with admiration. I'm so proud of the strength you've shown. She looked down, a small smile tugging at her lips. I couldn't have done it without you. I never thought I'd feel this safe. Mark leaned in, his eyes gleaming with warmth. You deserve this, Sara. You fought for it, and it's about time you get to enjoy it. Sara took a deep breath, letting herself absorb the love and pride that radiated from them. For the first time in her life, she felt like she was right where she belonged. As the evening continued, they shared stories, laughter echoing around the table. Paul told her stories of his childhood, tales that felt like a window into a world she'd never known, a world of stability, love, and laughter. Mark chimed in with jokes, his easy humor lightening the air, making her feel like she was part of something precious. After dinner, they took a leisurely walk through the quiet city streets, the cool night air refreshing against their skin. Sara glanced around, marveling at the lights that shimmered from the buildings above, feeling a deep contentment settle over her. Thank you, she said quietly, looking up at Paul and Mark, for everything, for giving me a chance to be part of this life. Paul wrapped an arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. Sara, you're not just part of our lives. You're family, and nothing's going to change that. Mark nodded, his voice soft but sincere. We're in this together, Sara. Whatever happens next, we face it as a team. They walked in comfortable silence, the bond between them stronger than ever. As they neared Paul's apartment, Sara felt a sense of closure settle over her, as if all the fear and pain she had carried for so long were finally giving way to peace. The next morning, as they sat around the breakfast table, a knock at the door broke the quiet. Paul stood up, exchanging a quick, puzzled glance with Mark, then went to open it. Detective Keller stood there, his expression serious but respectful. Good morning, Mr. Paul, Miss Sara, Mark, he greeted them, nodding politely. I wanted to update you on the case. Paul invited him inside, and they all took their seats around the living room. Sara felt a knot of anxiety twist in her stomach as she waited for the detective to speak. We followed up on the accusations and the details you provided. Detective Keller began, looking directly at Sara. It turns out the allegations were unfounded. We confirmed your whereabouts for each of the incidents, and we have identified the witness who made the false statements. Sara's eyes widened, relief flooding through her. So, it's over? I'm really free from all this? The detective nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips. Yes, Miss Sara, it's over. We believe that this was, in fact, a personal vendetta, a deliberate attempt to interfere with your progress. We've taken the necessary steps to ensure it won't happen again. Paul reached over, placing a comforting hand on Sara's shoulder, pride radiating from him. Thank you, Detective Keller. You have no idea what this means to us." Detective Keller nodded, his gaze warm as he looked at Sara. "It was my pleasure. Everyone deserves a fair chance, Miss Sara, and I'm glad you can finally move forward without this weighing you down." After the detective left, Sara leaned back on the couch, exhaling deeply. She felt a wave of relief wash over her, followed by an overwhelming sense of gratitude. She looked at Paul and Mark, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. I didn't think this day would ever come," she whispered, her voice filled with emotion. "To be able to live without looking over my shoulder. It's like a dream." Paul wrapped her in a hug, his embrace warm and steady. "You deserve this freedom, Sara. You've earned it." Mark joined them, placing a comforting hand on her back. "You're one of the strongest people I know, Sara, and now you get to live the life you've always deserved." They sat together in silence for a few moments, each lost in their own thoughts, the weight of the journey they had shared settling over them. After a while, Sara spoke, her voice soft but determined. "I want to make a difference. I want to help others who are going through what I went through. Maybe I can give someone else the same chance you gave me." Paul's face broke into a proud smile, his eyes gleaming. "I think that's a beautiful idea, Sara, and we'll support you every step of the way." Mark nodded enthusiastically. "You've got so much to offer, Sara. There are people out there who need someone like you, someone who understands." For the rest of the day, they talked about Sara's dreams and ideas, mapping out a future filled with purpose and hope. She felt a surge of excitement, a feeling she hadn't allowed herself to experience in years. And for the first time, she saw a clear path forward, a life built not only on survival but on compassion, resilience, and love. As the sun set that evening, Sara stood by the window, watching the colors bleed across the sky. She felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude, a deep, profound appreciation for Paul, for Mark, and for the family they had become. Turning back to them, she smiled, her heart full. "Thank you for everything. I don't think I could ever repay you for all you've done." Paul shook his head, his expression gentle. "You don't need to repay us, Sara. This is what family does." Mark chimed in, grinning. "And besides, you being here with us? That's all we need." As they stood together, a quiet understanding passed between them, a shared acknowledgement of the journey they had taken, the battles they had fought, and the life they had built together. For the first time in her life, Sara knew that she was truly, deeply home. A few weeks passed, and Sara had begun to settle into a routine that brought her comfort and stability. She spent her days helping Paul around the apartment, volunteering at a local community center, and making plans for her future. She was no longer haunted by the fear of her past, and each day, she felt more certain that she was right where she was meant to be. One sunny afternoon, as they sat around the kitchen table, Paul looked at Sara, his face filled with warmth. "You know, Sara, I don't think I've ever seen you this peaceful. You have this glow about you." Sara blushed, her smile soft but radiant. "I think it's because, for the first time in my life, I'm not just surviving. I'm living, and it feels incredible." Mark grinned, reaching across the table to nudge her playfully. "About time you realized that, huh? I always knew you'd be unstoppable once you found your footing." Sara laughed, the sound light and free. "I guess it just took me a little longer to get here." As they continued talking, the doorbell rang. Paul exchanged a glance with Mark, who shrugged, then went to answer the door. Sara continued her conversation with Paul, unaware of the surprise waiting at the threshold. A moment later, Mark returned, but he wasn't alone. Standing beside him was a woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile. She looked to be in her late 50s, with gray-streaked hair tied back in a loose bun, wearing a warm but curious expression. "Sara," Mark said, his voice filled with quiet excitement. "This is Emily, the director of the community center. She wanted to meet you personally." Sara rose, slightly startled, and extended her hand. "Oh, hi. It's really nice to meet you, Ms. Emily. I've enjoyed volunteering at the center these past few weeks." Emily took her hand warmly, her smile growing. "Please, just call me Emily. And I must say, I've heard wonderful things about you, Sara." Everyone at the center speaks so highly of your dedication and kindness. I wanted to thank you in person." Sara glanced down, feeling a bit shy under the praise. "Thank you, Emily. Honestly, volunteering there has given me so much. I didn't think I'd be able to connect with people this way." "Not after everything." Emily's eyes softened, and she pulled up a chair beside Sara, her tone gentle. "We all have a story, Sara, and sometimes it's the people who've been through the hardest battles who end up making the biggest difference." Sara nodded, a quiet determination settling over her. "I want to give back. I want to help others find a way forward, the way Paul and Mark helped me." Emily exchanged a glance with Paul and Mark, a twinkle in her eye. "Well, if that's the case, I might just have something for you. We're starting a new mentorship program for young people who need guidance and support, people who might feel lost, just as you once did." Sara's eyes widened with excitement. "Really? You think I'd be able to help?" Emily nodded, her smile warm. "Absolutely. You have a strength, Sara, a resilience that others can see and feel. You'd be a wonderful role model, showing them that it's possible to find a path, no matter how dark things might seem." Paul placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "What do you think, Sara? This sounds like an amazing opportunity." Sara felt her heart swell with emotion as she looked at each of them. I think I'd love that. I know what it's like to feel alone, to feel like there's no way out. If I can help just one person see that things can get better, that would mean everything to me." Mark grinned, his eyes bright. Then it settled. "Our Sara is officially a mentor." Emily reached into her bag, pulling out a small folder. "Here's some information about the program. Take your time to read through it and let us know when you're ready to start. I have no doubt that you'll be incredible." Sara took the folder, feeling a mixture of excitement and nervousness. She glanced at Paul and Mark, their encouraging smiles filling her with a renewed sense of purpose. "Thank you, Emily. I'll read it over tonight." Emily patted her hand. "I'm looking forward to seeing you in action, Sara. You're exactly the kind of person this program needs." After Emily left, Sara sat with Paul and Mark, her heart racing with anticipation. They talked late into the night, discussing her plans, her hopes, and her dreams. For the first time, Sara allowed herself to imagine a future that was bright and filled with possibility. As the evening wound down, she looked at Paul and Mark, her voice soft but resolute. "Thank you for everything. I don't think I'll ever be able to repay you, but I want you to know that you've given me a life I never thought I'd have." Paul's eyes were filled with emotion as he reached over, holding her hand gently. "Sara, you don't owe us anything. Seeing you thrive, seeing you find happiness, that's all we could ever ask for." Mark leaned in, his tone playful but sincere. "Besides, you're family, and family doesn't keep score." Sara's eyes glistened with tears as she hugged them both, her heart overflowing with gratitude. "I love you both, more than I can say." They held each other in a warm embrace, a shared understanding passing between them. Sara knew that no matter where life took her, she would always have a place to call home, a family who loved her, flaws and all. Thank you for watching Sara's journey to the end. Stories like this remind us that the past doesn't have to define our future, but moving on takes courage and the right people by our side. What Sara went through teaches us about the importance of resilience and self-worth. Sometimes, we have to be willing to let go of what no longer serves us, even if it's painful. But moving forward isn't about forgetting. It's about honoring where we've been while choosing who we want to become. Let's remember to support those who are finding their way, just as Sara's new family stood by her when she needed it most. If this story touched your heart, leave a comment below with your thoughts. Don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share this story with others. Your support means the world to us and helps bring more impactful stories to light.